on the day when I was pushing 2 lectures into one, I managed to leave that art at home on my kitchen counter. So that's why I'm late. I don't have it. I just went and grabbed the 2 lectures. This is going to be a little bumpier than usual. It was a really, really good lecture I was going to give. But we'll do this one instead. We're going to focus on Weber today, and what I'm going to be doing is giving you the background that you need to understand what's at stake in the 2 essays that you are reading as our final reading for this course. One is an essay on politics as a vocation, and one an essay on science as a vocation. And it's important to know that science in the German refers to knowledge beyond simply natural science. It doesn't have our narrow meaning. It refers more generally to the accumulation of knowledge or the practice of knowledge, especially academic knowledge for Weber. You'll be reading those 2 essays this week and next. And I'm going to today give you the background on in Weber's thought that will help you understand what is at stake in both of those essays. We start with Weber's life, as usual, and in some ways you could almost tell the story because it follows the usual contours of modern political theorists that we have read so far. Upper middle class origins, he was meant to be a lawyer, he studied but he never ended up practicing law, he began to suffer from repeated mental breakdowns. That's the story. If you can't keep straight which story is Mill's and which Bentham's and Tocqueville's or Nietzsche's or Marx's or Weber's, it's not your fault. Most were expected to study law. All either broke radically with their fathers, or their fathers died at an early age, or they imagined their fathers died. And each suffered either from a mental breakdown or from lack of recognition, or both. It's hard to know what to do with this common thread, except maybe there's a warning here. If you're thinking about law school and you're a little bit mentally fragile, you could end up as a political theorist. The particulars of Weber's version are this. He was born to a bourgeois household. His father was a politician in Bismarck. His mother was a religious liberal who ministered to the poor. And it was a miserable marriage, and Weber, by all accounts, just sided with his mother. He really loathed his father from a very early age. More about that in a moment. He went off to study law. At the time in Germany, the study of law had a very strong historical emphasis. And Weber was not particularly interested in law, but he got really interested in history as a result of this, and in the economic and social settings of the development of law. So he did, in fact, end up getting a law degree and even practiced law briefly. But by the time he'd finished his work in law, his life had already taken a very academic, intellectual turn. And he studied on his own history, political economy, languages, and what we would today call comparative religions. In fact, when he completed his schooling, he became a professor of economics. At that time, much less of a narrow field than it is now, really more broadly, kind of political economy and sociology. As he started his career, he married a distant cousin, and for about 5 years, he had a good enough life as a young married professor. And then he had a dramatic argument with his father, after which his father dropped dead. So Weber then began his own battles with mental illness, apparently triggered by an overwhelming sense of guilt, but also obviously much more complicated, and in fact complicated in a way that Nietzsche would help us with, and maybe even Freud. There is in Weber an amazing degree of asceticism. That is something that Nietzsche and Freud both diagnosed as a kind of turning against the self, turning against life. You can see it in Weber's overweening sense of conscience and rectitude, especially moral rectitude, and you'll see that force in both of the essays that you read. You can also see it in Weber in that push for objectivity. And remember that Nietzsche defines the push for objectivity as the consummation of an ascetic formation, as the essence of trying to extinguish the person from the practice of knowledge. So Weber represents, both in his being and in his work, what Nietzsche called the illness of modernity, what Freud describes as the suffering of the modern, and he almost knows it. That is, there's a certain consciousness of Weber about the tensions that his life and his work embody. To finish his story, he tried to work whenever he was well enough, but all he had to do was face the lecture hall and he would collapse again. So he couldn't hold down a teaching post, obviously. He read and he wrote when he could. His capacity for erudition was simply astonishing, really unmatched in the 19th century and early 20th. He read histories of every kind, political economy, religion, philosophy, social theory, and more or less wrote across the same fields. He struggled throughout his life to repair his mental and physical health well enough to write and even lecture again. And in his final year of existence, he did return to teaching and lecturing, and then, ironically, was felled by pneumonia. So that's the life in brief. Politically, Weber is really difficult to classify in contemporary terms. What remains constant throughout Weber's work is his belief in the power purposes of states, the value of powerful political leaders, and even in nationalism and imperialism. More generally, we could say what remains constant is his belief that power is the currency of politics. Ideas matter, ethics matter, and so forth, but power is its stuff. That said, he's not rigidly right-wing. He takes power to be the basic stuff and value of political life, and his critiques of Marxism, socialism, pacifism, are that they don't grasp this. They don't get, in his view, that the power instinct in man and in states is at the bottom of things. That said, Weber also sympathized with working class politics, and he certainly affirmed the value of constitutional democracy. So we have a curious mix in Weber, a mix we don't see very often in contemporary political life. His aspiration for Germany in particular was that it would not only be a constitutional democracy, but also make itself powerful and glorious, not bullying and dominant. And he recognized that the one could easily slide over into the other. And he was very clear that nation states should aspire to prestige, power, and glory, not simply to be bullying and overwhelming. I'm raising this because we have to ask of Weber, though we won't answer it at length, just what we asked of Nietzsche. How does his thinking fit into the development of National Socialism and fascism that would arise shortly after his death? Parts of Weber's work were indeed taken up by the Nazis. He wasn't as flamboyant and as openly or apparently anti-Semitic as some of Nietzsche's remarks were, but the nationalism is there, the call for German glory is there, and it was used by Nazis. But the larger question we have to ask is, again, the question about power politics. The emphasis on power politics that's coursing through the age and through a number of the thinkers that we've studied. With Nietzsche, with Freud, with Weber, we're in a kind of different orbit than we were in with Tocqueville, with Mill, with Bentham, even with Marx. That is, the increasing emphasis in these last three thinkers has been on the prestige and power of man, and in some cases of the state. And what's fading away is the preoccupation we immersed ourselves in the beginning of the course, in questions about the nature of democracy, justice, individual liberty, and ends. We're quite far now with Nietzsche, with Freud, with Weber, from the idea of achieving the greatest happiness for the greatest number, the governance principle of Bentham. We're quite far from the idea of individual liberty to pursue your own ends. That was the ideal of Mill. And we're quite far, of course, from the Republican virtue of participatory democracy that we saw in Tocqueville. There's lots of reasons for this, and I don't want to suggest that the reasons, as many people have suggested, are mostly German. And I'm going to try to return to this question next week when we do our final work on Weber. What I'd like to do now is note one last important feature of his work in general that we could spend weeks on. I'm just going to give you a very brief sense of it, namely Weber's commitment to objectivity, to science, and to what he calls a fact-value distinction, the importance of being able to distinguish facts from values, and the idea that you can keep facts and values apart. Weber is, as many of you may already know, often considered the founder, or at least a founder, not only of sociology, but of modern social science more generally. And one of the reasons he's considered a founder is that he believes that it is possible to engage in value-neutral, objective accounts of states, of societies, of human action, of relations of power, of forms of organization. He worked assiduously to achieve this objectivity, and you will feel it in the very quality of his writing. I'm not saying that he achieved such objectivity. Rather, it is the premise of his social scientific work. Now, I'm emphasizing this because the two essays that we're reading are often called his values essays. They are the essays in which he is telling you what he really thinks. So they are unusual. They're Weber telling you what his own values, what his own positions are. But even in those essays, you'll see the long wind-up to the question of what he really thinks in the form of an ostensibly objective presentation of the conditions of knowledge or the conditions of politics. What we have to do in grappling with this quest for objectivity is ask, first of all, what it does to what Weber is presenting. That is, he will present the world as it is, as a set of facts, that also has the effect of more or less making the world as it must be. That is, the commitment to objectivity or facticity in Weber also moves into a certain conservatism, a certain presentation of relations of power, existing forms of government, of domination, and so forth, as things that more or less must be the way that they are. That said, Weber, like Freud, will in the 20th century be seized upon by critical theorists to rework. Critical theorists, especially again those theorists of the Frankfurt School, will take hold of Weber's work, use the descriptions he offers as a diagnosis of what's wrong with reality. So just as that happened with Freud, we'll have another attempt at social science. Remember, Freud was also giving us a science of the psyche. We'll have another attempt at social science that will both be powerful in founding a field of psychoanalysis in Freud's case, the field of sociology in Weber's, but at the same time become an important resource for a critical opposition, critical theorists and activists. Okay, so that's really all I'm going to say about the question of objectivity and science and the fact-value distinction. I'm just wanting to mark it and note it because we're not going to be focusing primarily on that dimension of Weber, though you'll certainly see it in especially the essay on science as a vocation, and we will be grappling with it a bit there. All right, what I want to do now is really teach you a little bit about Weber's theory of types of rationality. And I'll do this by summarizing some work from a text that you're not reading called Economy and Society, where Weber gives us an account of three basic types of action and the rationality or reasoning that accompanies these three types of action. The first is affective, meaning referring to the affects, the feelings. action and thinking based on emotion, feeling. The second is traditional. Here, action and the reasoning that goes with it is based on tradition, custom, obedience. So if in the first case, our action is based on a particular attachment to a leader or belief in an ideal, in the second case, our action and the reasoning that goes with it is based on custom, tradition, what we understand to be the right thing to do, what we've always done, what we understand to be the practice of obedience to our ways of life. The third type of action, Weber calls rational. It's based on rational calculation. So Weber joins the general Enlightenment conviction that rational action, and he will eventually also suggest legitimacy based on rational action. Rational action is coming increasingly to prevail in the modern world. Put the other way around, Weber joins many of our other theorists in arguing that action and thought, in order to be acceptable, in order to be legitimate, must increasingly hew to a rational basis. He will add that forms of authority in the contemporary modern European world are increasingly bound to rationality as well, rather than to charisma, rather than to custom, rather than to religion, tradition, and so forth. Now again, as I've said, with the exception of Nietzsche, we've seen a version of this claim. The world is becoming more rational. We're accepting reason more and more as the basis of action, authority, legitimacy. We've seen a version of this claim in every thinker we've looked at this term. We've seen a version of the claim that the old bases of life and action and thought, religious bases, traditional bases, associative bases, that these are giving way to the Enlightenment demand for reasoned bases of authority, action, and so forth. Weber is not sanguine about this unfolding. It's not that he objects to it in a deep way, and it's not that he simply laments the loss of older ways of life. Weber's insight, Weber's genius, I think, is to understand what a commitment to rational action and what a world dominated by rational action does to the world of values and meaning. And to rush to the conclusion, it not only empties the world out of values and meaning, but it will also create the basis for the most unprecedented forms of domination that the world has ever known. But to get to that conclusion, we have to go on our usual long walk. So first we need to go back to rational action, which Weber divides into two types, what he calls value rationality and instrumental rationality. So what are these? Value rational action for Weber is shaped by the constant commitment to a value, a rationally chosen value, but a value. It could be anything. It could be democracy. It could be fascism. It could be peace. It could be state glory. In value rational action, what is important is that the action itself is never separated from the value. That is, if the commitment is to peace, then one's actions must be peaceful. If the commitment is to democracy, all action must be democratic. That's value rational action. Instrumentally rational action is different because the value might still be peace or democracy or state glory or fascism or anything else, but the value doesn't shape the action itself. The value is simply the end. And instrumentally rational action is action that is a pure calculation of the most effective way to get to the end. It is what we say today, being purely calculating and instrumental about how to achieve one's end. So it's a pure calculation of what Weber says is the most effective and efficient means to get to the end. And Weber adds that instrumental rationality produces the greatest efficiency of means to ends. Nothing gets in your way in instrumentally rational action. No morals, no ethics, no other constraints. And that's why it yields, as a form of action, the maximum capacity to achieve ends. Weber also calls instrumentally rational action action that is more free than any other kind of action. It's more free because it's not constrained by any kind of limits or morality. It's liberated from custom, from religion, from tradition, from ethics, and so forth. So what Weber sees is that the increasing embrace of instrumental rationality in the modern world, which is the situation he sees, the increasing embrace of it in politics, in economics, and in all dimensions of life, is born from a certain a human urge for freedom and power, but is also born from what Nietzsche called the death of God, by which he simply meant the displacement of God as the central authority or determinant of our actions, and that instrumentally rational action can't really be set loose until we are released from religion, custom, tradition, and so forth. But it's also born from a certain instinct for power, an instinct to develop more and more, not just personal power, but powerful ways of achieving things in the world. Now, what's going to worry Weber is not just that instrumentally rational action becomes ubiquitous in modernity and thus produces more and more of a kind of calculating and unscrupulous character in the world. What's really going to worry him is a phenomenon, I don't need to write it on the board, that he calls the process of rationalization. By rationalization, he doesn't mean what we usually mean. Justifying cheating on an exam because everybody else does, or any other kind of rationalization of an action. It's related to that, but it's deeper. Rationalization, as Weber introduces the term, refers to the saturation of the whole social, economic, political, and cultural field with instrumental rationality. What Weber understands is that affective and traditional forms of action simply can't hold their own against the power of instrumentally rational action. He understands that affective and traditional forms of action can't hold their form against the power of rationality more generally. As soon as somebody starts asking you a set of questions, why do you always do that ritual? And you try to answer, well, because I always have. And they start pummeling you with reasons. You come up empty after a while. All you're left with is, well, because we do, because I do. But it doesn't hold up against reason. Weber understands that those other forms of action and those other forms of practice can't hold up against rationality, but he also understands that value rationality can't hold up against instrumental rationality. So what rationality does in submitting everything to the power of reason and calculation is slowly kill off all other values. And thus what Weber understands is that what starts out as a pure instrument, instrumental rationality, it's an instrument for getting what you want. It's an instrument to an end. What starts out as an instrument of particular ends will eventually end up swallowing or swallowing or destroying those ends with instrumental rationality itself. So let's be clear. Weber's critique is not that instrumental rationality is immoral. Remember, he's value neutral. He's simply describing a world. His critique is that precisely because of its power, the power of instrumental rationality, and because of its amorality, not its immorality, its amorality, its indifference to morality, it will eventually destroy even the values to which it may have originally been harnessed. Instrumental rationality, he understands, eventually becomes all there is. Nothing else can stand up to its power. It will infect every domain of life, every activity, every vocation, every practice, every institution. It causes all ends or aims to be overwhelmed or subverted by instrumental means. Instrumental rationality won't stay subordinate to ends or values. Thus, for example, bureaucracy, which arises, he says, as an instrument of the state originally. It represents pure instrumental rationality. That's what bureaucracies are. They're instruments to obtaining ends. They eventually become their own ends. Or capitalism, which he understands as an instrument of wealth production to satisfy human needs. It becomes an end of it in itself. And it swallows us in its own instrumental calculations. So a fully rationalized world, a world of nothing but instrumental rationality, is, in Weber's understanding, scientific understanding, a world that will finally be a world without soul, without purpose, without value. It will be what he calls a fully disenchanted world. Disenchanted. The enchantment of the world will be gone. The enchantment of creatures in it will be gone. It will be a world in which nothing is sacred. Nothing has intrinsic value. Everything is a means to something else. Everything's on an instrumental grid. It's a world in which values, Weber says, will disappear. It's a world of nihilism. But it's worse than that for Weber. It will also be a world in which we all become cogs in a giant rational action machinery. And I haven't explained how that could be yet, but I will in a moment. So this is the world Weber sees as pretty much inevitable, because once instrumental rationality gains ascendancy, as it has, it can't be stopped. So what we have from Weber is a diagnosis of the misery of our world, in a sense, from a very different angle than that we got from Nietzsche or Freud. It's not about asceticism or repression or life turning against life. It's simply life emptied out of all meaning. Life as purposelessness and life as an order of a giant set of machineries of domination. One can't be, in his view, instrumentally rational in the pursuit, for example, of religion or love or learning or community or art or even democracy, and still realize the value of those things. They can't be submitted to an instrumentally rational calculus. And when they are, they're changed from ends in themselves into means for something else. Weber goes beyond this diagnosis of mere meaninglessness. He actually suggests that modern man is, as he puts it, entrapped in an iron cage. That's his language, an iron cage by this order of things. That what initially emerges as a form of power to free us ends up as the most severe form of domination that humans have ever experienced. So now, to see this domination effect, we need to turn to the modern systems, especially bureaucracy and capitalism, that Weber sees as both cause and effect of the rationalization of the modern world. So we're going to turn now to think very briefly about capitalism and the modern bureaucratic state. Weber learned a lot from Marx. Didn't agree with his critique of capitalism, but he learned a lot from Marx's description of the workings of capitalism. And you'll see that as I describe Weber's own account of capitalism. He believed that capitalism entailed rationalization, that overtaking of all ends with instrumentally rational action, on two interrelated levels. First, it separates the worker from the means of production. So it separates the worker from actually controlling the domain and the instruments of production. And secondly, it separates what he calls the productive means, the extraction of labor from workers, from the productive ends, selling the product on the market for a profit. So far sounds rather similar to Marx. The difference is Weber's attempting to describe this all quite neutrally. What do these separations entail? For Weber, capitalism is the most efficient mode of production ever to have unfolded on the planet, precisely because of these separations, because of separating the worker from the means of production and separating the extraction of labor from workers, the domain of production, from the place of exchange, the domain of the market. In other words, the activity of maximizing profit, which Weber understands capitalism to be engaged in, required rationalizing the means to profit, being instrumental about it. And that's accomplished by eliminating workers' control over production, organizing the factory rationally, reducing workers to mere means, making them and machinery substitutable. And it's also accomplished by treating all persons, workers, capitalists, consumers, investors, all, as mere instruments or obstacles to profit. It entails what Weber calls the end of personal loyalties, ties, and aims. So as workers are separated from the means of production, as they become mere means of production at the same time, so also do the means and ends of production become separated into two distinct classes in society. So Weber says rationalization in capitalism works at two levels. Technically, it involves simply rationalizing the mode of production and separating workers from their means of sustenance. But at a social level, it means reducing the masses, Weber's language, to means for profit maximization and forcing them to become instrumentally rational because they can't survive any other way. And forcing the masses essentially to become the means of profit generation, which is embodied or enjoyed in an altogether different class. So Weber is essentially describing the 99% as the means for the 1%. Now, here, though, is one of those places where instrumental rationality ends up saturating the whole project. Because Weber thinks capitalism emerges as an unprecedentedly powerful system of producing wealth and producing stuff for human needs. But the instrumental rationality that capitalism employs, a rationality which separates means from ends everywhere, ends up as a mode of production that enslaves all. What Weber tells us is that it's designed, capitalism is emerged and designed as the most powerful system ever for dominating life conditions. Again, you can see how much he gets from Marx here. But it becomes a system that ends up dominating life itself, not just life conditions. It dominates life itself. It dominates the capitalist as well as the worker with purely instrumental rationality or calculation. Put another way, Weber understands that once capitalism really gets up and going, it becomes its own end. It becomes the end of the end or the value of everything. The health of the nation is measured by the health of the economy, which means levels of profit, investment, employment, inflation, etc. It's not measured by human well-being or satisfaction or quality of life. Does this mean Weber opposes capitalism? No. He's a scientist. Remember, he's just describing. Now, if we move, and I'm giving you very brief accounts of this, from capitalism to bureaucracy, that other giant machinery of domination that worries Weber, Weber argues that bureaucracy is simply born as the most efficient political machinery to exercise domination on the face of the earth. Its sole principle is instrumentally rational action. Everywhere bureaucracy separates means from ends. The bureaucrat, indeed the bureaucracy itself, is nothing but a means. It's supposed to be completely separated from the ends it serves. So bureaucracy serves capitalism or serves the state or serves the university, but it doesn't presumably comprise its aims. It's just an instrument. It separates persons from functions. It separates functions from overall ends. So we have means-end separations all over the place, the sign of instrumentally rational action. The problem, of course, is that, as Weber tells the story, bureaucracies like capitalism come to take on a life of their own. They come to be forms of domination of their own. And bureaucratic rationality comes to be the mentality that ends up, as it were, governing the state or governing the university or governing the corporation rather than the other way around. So the radical depersonalization of bureaucracy on every level that makes it so powerful also is what comes to organize human life everywhere. So the picture we've begun to glean, and there's much more to say about Weber on bureaucracy, but the picture we've begun to glean is that for Weber, the completely bureaucratized state and the completely bureaucratized economy means that rationalization, the elimination of substantive values from life, has already gone quite far. And what we need to ask now is, how did this happen? How did that freest form of action, instrumentally rational action, come to consolidate itself into systems that wholly dominate human life and human activity? How does this form of freedom, which is initially how Weber identifies instrumentally rational action, literally turn into its opposite and come to dominate the human beings it contains? To answer this, we need just a few more minutes of lecture. We need to move into Weber's analytics of power to get to the problem of domination. Weber's often described as a liberal theorist in the sense that he embraces rights. He's interested in a constitutional state. He's committed to individual liberty. But as you've already gathered, he's no ordinary liberal. Because, as I said at the beginning of lecture, he treats power as the essence of economic and social and political life. Weber never, ever analyzes an empirical problem without asking about the bearing of power on it and the working of power in it. So in this regard, he's probably closer in the tradition of political theory to Hobbes and Machiavelli than to any other theorist. But he stands apart from Hobbes and Machiavelli because for Weber, power never reduces to one type. He's attuned to all the internal differences and variety of power, and he makes great use of the German language's own rich vocabulary of power. He distinguishes authority from legitimate domination or legitimate authority, from violence, from power itself, and from rule and from domination. He uses those 6 or 7 terms very precisely and very differently according to what he's analyzing. Give me a second. I have to find my way in here to get to what I want to tell you about. In Weber's view, all political life is something like an order of domination, a system of domination. You can't have domination in Weber's understanding without 2 other elements, namely violence and authority. It's interesting to contemplate that fact because for many other theorists, you only need one or the other to make political power sustained or continuous. Indeed, for many theorists, wherever there's authority or legitimacy, you don't need violence. That's mostly the point of liberal social contract theory. If you have a legitimate order, then you don't need violence all the time. And for many theorists, if there's violence, it means that legitimacy is probably contestable or even vanishing. For Weber, both authority and violence are always present in political regimes. Indeed, for him, the domain of the political could even be said to be composed of their mixture. Pure violence without authority is kind of pre-political. It's not yet a settled political regime. And pure authority without violence, and this is crucial for his critique of all of his left-wing compatriots, pure authority without violence is non-political. So religion, philosophy, science, all of which Weber will formulate as necessarily unpolitical or non-political because they're not really centrally engaging power. Now, the really interesting question for Weber is how violence and authority work together, how they produce an order, a regime. What Weber understands about political orders is that they always consolidate, as I've suggested, violence, authority, and legitimacy as institutions or systems. So a state structure, Weber defines, for example, as a relation of men dominating men, a relation supported by means of legitimate violence. So watch all the words in there. A state structure is a relation of men dominating men, a relation supported by means of legitimate violence. A capitalist structure he defines as an order designed for meeting the needs of human beings in the most rational fashion possible that also commands routine acts and behaviors of all. So domination is the systematization of elements of rule, of power, of knowledge, authority, and violence. The systematization of all of those things into a regime that exceeds any of these elements by themselves. What he calls domination is a structure of subordination that's sustained by a means of enforcement, a role of legitimacy, and authority. So now let's return to our founding question. How can something that starts out as the expression of the capacity for human freedom, instrumental rationality, end up as a form of total domination? The answer for Weber is when this freedom is attached to the quest to dominate life conditions itself. When this instrumental rationality as a form of action is attached to the specific quest to dominate life conditions themselves, say through capitalism's provision for human needs or bureaucracy's capacity to order actions. When these are the projects to which instrumental rationality is harnessed, it's harnessed to these projects of power. And because these projects require the separation of means from ends everywhere, they literally turn us into their means. We become the cogs in the machineries of systems of domination. Systems that are born out of our capacities for power and for freedom, our capacities for action and reason. To put this whole matter a little bit differently, what Weber sees in modernity is how human beings are not simply brought together in communities of common interest. That's social contract theory. He sees not simply that we're engaged in some kind of collaborative wealth production through pursuit of individual economic interest and a hidden hand that organizes the whole thing. That's laissez-faire economic theory. What Weber sees is how orders of aims and rationalities are fashioned into systems of action, command, authority, and legitimacy that fully dominate those who inhabit them. Let's approach this one last time by just thinking about Weber on the question of bureaucracy. What Weber says about bureaucracy is that it begins as a quest for control, but when this quest is installed into a system of domination that maximizes control, it will end up extinguishing human freedom. Let me just read to you from a passage in a minor essay that Weber wrote on bureaucracy. An inanimate machine is mind objectified. This is what provides it with the power to force men into its service and dominate their everyday working life as completely as is the case in the factory. Objectified intelligence is also that animated machine, the bureaucratic organization, with its specialization of trained skills, division of jurisdiction, rules, and hierarchical relations of authority. Together with inanimate machines, bureaucracy is busy fabricating the shell of bondage, which men will be forced to inhabit someday, as powerless as the fellows of ancient Egypt. Now, what Weber will end up arguing about what he understands to be bureaucracy and bureaucratic life overtaking the nature of organizations and especially the state is that the major task in politics today is to think and act politically outside this machine and even against this machine. And the reason is not simply because the machine dominates us, it does, but because he thinks it systematically destroys the values and aims that make politics worthwhile and that give value and meaning to life itself. Let me give you one more account from one of Weber's minor writings and wrap this up. He says, it's as though we knowingly and willingly were supposed to become men who need order and nothing but order. That the world knows nothing more than such men of order makes the central question not how we further and accelerate it, but what we have to set against this machinery in order to preserve a remnant of humanity from this parceling out of the soul, this exclusive rule of bureaucratic life ideals. And here we have an interesting note to make about Weber. It turns out that freedom is, for him, finally made with what he calls the soul, the place of what he calls the conscious choice of what's valuable and important in life. And we have overtones here of Mill and other thinkers who have developed this idea. What rationalization, the overtaking of instrumental rationality in all domains of life does, above all for him, is kill the soul. It inherently entails, indeed, it fosters soullessness of action. Not only obedience resulting from discipline, but instrumental calculation everywhere. Decisions issuing entirely from instrumental rationality. So we have in Weber, on the one hand, freedom expressed as freedom from subjective and traditional constraints, freedom from affective or traditional or religious orders of authority, in order to be rational, in order to be able to choose. That's one notion of freedom in Weber. And on the other hand, freedom for him is rooted in a deep inner life. Subjectivity, the soul, the place of meaning, the place of value. And the irony, of course, in Weber is that the first kind of freedom, freedom from affective and traditional authority, freedom from being dominated by religion, by custom, by constraint and irrationality, freedom from all of that, when it's expressed as rational action and patched into a whole order of domination, will kill off that second kind of, that second source of freedom, the freedom that he thinks emanates from the soul, emanates from the value of human interiority and human life. Okay, let me just take one moment to introduce you to one last thing I didn't actually put on the board today, which is the notion of charisma as Weber develops it, because you're going to need it for your reading of the two essays. So just a very quick thing on charisma. So I've given you these accounts of rationality or action. Weber also uses roughly this type, this tripart typology to talk about three kinds of authority. And the difference is, instead of talking about affective authority, in the first case, he talks about charismatic authority. So we have charismatic authority, traditional authority, and what he will call rational legal authority. He says all authority can be divided into those three types. Anytime you find authority, just figure out which type it is. Is it charismatic? Is it a leader who is operating through charisma? Is it traditional? We simply respect and accord honors to this authority because it's the way we've always done things. Or is it rational legal? Is it based in a principle of law and not necessarily justice, but is it based in a principle of law or rule? He's really fascinated by charismatic authority for several reasons. First of all, he knows it's first in the order of history itself. All authority, he thinks, is charismatic in the beginning, even parental authority. So he's fascinated by it for that reason, but he's also fascinated by the fact that it's creative and productive, not just for the charismatic leader herself or himself, but in its effects. And he's fascinated by it because he understands it as the absolute opposite of rational legal authority. It's the opposite of the way rational legal authority is instantiated in the modern state or modern bureaucracy. Charismatic authority is not regularized. It's not orderly. It's not departmentalized. It's not jurisdictionally confined. It's not about rules. It's not about functions. It issues from what he calls inner determination and inner restraint. Inner determination and inner restraint of the leader herself or himself. It lays its claim, he says, through the imputation or imputing of gifts or magical powers to the charismatic leader. We imagine the leader to be capable of all kinds of things and having a special power or set of gifts. Remember it's hard to remember it now, but remember the response to Obama when he first burst on the political scene. That kind of imputation of powers and gifts and capacities and hope and future and redemption is what Weber's trying to get at. So it lays its claim through imputing gifts or magical powers to the charismatic figure, and it's conferred through performance and recognition. The leader has to perform and the followers recognize. So the charismatic figure performs his or her magic and expresses a compelling mission, and the followers recognize and respond. Again, that's just the opposite of authority based on rules and functions and orders and rationality, reason. Weber says at one point, charisma as a creative power recedes in the face of domination, which hardens into lasting institutions. Charisma as a creative power recedes in the face of domination, which hardens into lasting institutions. So he's letting you know that it can't last as an enduring form of domination, what we just visited in thinking about the modern state or modern capitalism. It doesn't work there. And it doesn't work, as it were, over successors and generations and so forth. Charisma is a form of power and authority that is destroyed by institutionalization. There is, in fact, for Weber, no such thing as purely charismatic domination. There's charismatic authority, but not charismatic domination. There can be a charismatic ruler wielding an instrument or machinery of domination. So Hitler wielding a bureaucracy, or Roosevelt wielding a welfare state, or Osama bin Laden, or Obama, or even Gandhi, or Nelson Mandela. Any of those characters can be wielding an instrument of domination, but the charisma itself is not the domination. It works apart from it. And that's what you need to bear in mind as you read Politics as a Vocation, because Weber is going to be calling for the importance of charismatic leaders to contest or put an interval between machineries of domination and some other kind of purposes and hopes and possibilities in political life. Okay, let me stop there and see what you want to ask about, because I moved through a lot of material very quickly. Yes. Just a little bit louder.
This paper talking about creating artificial values,
Creating artificial boundaries like what?
Like how capitalism creates artificial boundaries
Between what?
between people that aren't inherent.
I see what you're saying, I think. So what he talks about a lot is what he calls the separations that capitalism entails. So it creates separations between the worker and the means of production. It creates separations between workers. It creates separations between the workers or producers and the realizations of profit and so forth. And if that's what you mean by artificial boundaries, he details that at great length. He also talks about the importance in capitalism of destroying personal connections for the machinery to work. In other words, that you cannot have in capitalism a set of systems of a world of fealties and personal obligations and commitments and entitlements. That it even if those are there, they will be destroyed or compromised by capitalism, because it works through dividing us all from the means of production, the realization of profit. It's a spectacularly powerful system in Weber's understanding, precisely because it breaks up all of those connections. And if you think about all the dramas that are based on sort of Godfather-like scenarios where there are personal fealties, but they're constantly being destroyed or interrupted by money or profit or other such things, Weber would offer you the diagnosis of that kind of thing. But did I get at your question? More or less? Okay. Yeah?
You mentioned that religion, philosophy, science weren't a system of domination.
Yeah. Okay. So what I said is Religion and philosophy and science are, for Weber, sources of authority in life. But they are not, for him, mixed with other elements that are crucial in politics. Violence, domination. Let me just leave it at those two. Even action. But most importantly, violence and domination. So what he thinks is the mistake of figures from Plato to Gandhi is that they are imagining that you can have in politics the prevalence of truth, a religious truth, a philosophical truth. We could add other figures in who might fantasize about the possibility of solving political problems with simply a regime of science. Even Hobbes flirts with that a little bit. The problem with all of these theorists is that they're not, or thinkers, is that they are not getting at the fundamental fact of politics, which is that it integrates or combines power, violence, rule, authority into systems of domination. Whereas science and philosophy and religion for him are orders of ideas or truth. He's even willing to grant them truth, not just science, but religion too. That the moment they begin to engage with political elements like violence, enforcement, domination, they've compromised their truth. They no longer stand as authorities. They lose their authority when they touch politics. But put the other way around, he thinks that those who wish philosophy could rule or religion could rule are in a fantasy about political life. They forget that its fundamental currency is power. Yes, it needs legitimacy. Yes, it needs authority. Yes, it has to use violence. But its fundamental currency is power. And the fundamental currency of these other things, religion, philosophy, science, is simply truth. So it's a really important question that you ask, because you'll see him in Science as a Vocation arguing for the radical separation of the pursuit of knowledge and politics. The radical distinction between political life and knowledge. And even arguing for the importance of, therefore, keeping politics out of the classroom, and in turn, keeping the pursuit of truth out of politics. So he will not argue that politics is about battle. It's about contestation. It's about forms of domination. And he's not only saying it's about ugly forms of domination, but it's about forms of arranging political life, human life, and these other things, religion, philosophy, science, are about truth. Yes?
Does this operate on a public-private split? Because it's making me think about domestic violence.
So, interestingly, it does not operate on a public-private split. For him, it operates on a knowledge-politics split. The split is between orders of truth and the pursuit of truth and the pursuit of knowledge on the one side, again, whether it's religious or philosophical or scientific or social scientific or anything else, and the order of politics on the other. So there's good reasons for you to be having that association to the question of domestic violence, but he is not, that's not what he's doing. He's not making a distinction between public and private. It's a distinction between knowledge and politics. I hope you have a wonderful break. I will see you on Tuesday. Let's go ahead and get going. This is our last week, and this week we'll be discussing Weber. Today, politics as a vocation. Thursday, science as a vocation. There's a note here that's really crucial. We were going to pass out the final in class, but realized if we passed it out in class on Thursday, that there are two sections that meet right after class, and it would be impossible not to be focused on the final at that moment, and impossible for the GSIs to keep setting aside your questions, and it makes more sense to just have a good Weber discussion and then get the final. So, what's really crucial, the Cal Mail, God's willing. Oh no, we don't need Cal Mail for B space. That's what you just told me. Okay. What's really crucial is that you be on B space. So can I just see right now, is there anybody who knows they're not on the B space log for this class? You've all been getting notices. You all know you're there. Okay. So this is key because the final will be posted at 5:30. You'll then have many days to do it. Won't take many days. You'll be answering one question. It will concern Weber. And you'll see it soon enough. Open book, open note, open discussion, not open to instructor consultation. That's the one thing that won't be available to you because it's just too difficult for us to not engage the question you're trying to answer. So 5:30 on Thursday, that's when you'll be getting the take-home final. Any questions? Okay, so be sure to check B-Space. You'll get the announcement. Well, if there is Cal Mail. Okay, you still have access to B-Space even if there isn't Cal Mail. Okay, so today we are going to be working on the first of two lectures that Weber gave pretty close to the end of his life, both by invitation. One on yes, Jack, sorry. Louder. Thank you. Okay, is that better? Yes. Okay, thank you for telling me. The two lectures that Weber offers, one is on politics as a vocation. The German word is Beruf, and he really means vocation, as we'll see, not job, not career. He really means Beruf, a calling, and in both cases. And one is on science understood in the large sense, knowledge, the study of the world, all elements of the world as a vocation. In order to get at what he's doing in the essay before us today, politics as a vocation, we need to return to something we talked about a week ago, which is Weber's analytics of power. Remember I told you that he makes use of all the different German words for power. We have them too. He distinguishes between power, rule, authority, violence, and domination. And it's this last term that I want to focus in on a little bit today because it helps us get at what Weber's trying to set against the contemporary age in developing what he calls the charismatic leader, or at times the sober political hero in politics as a vocation. So let's focus in on domination a little bit. What does Weber mean by it? He does not simply mean oppression. We tend to use those terms sometimes interchangeably. Rather, for Weber, domination is the expression of a structure. It's when power and authority and violence and rule all come together in a structure and mobilize everyone in the structure, mobilize and organize the conduct of everyone in the structure. I'm going to say this several different ways. So domination is not for him simply the enactment of power by one group on another. It's not simply the rule of law. It's not simply a legitimating discourse or authority. It's not simply violent policing. It's all of these. All of these integrated together in such a way that they act continuously on everyone. That's why he refers to domination always as a structure of domination. It has all of these elements that gather us together and organize us in a particular way, produce a particular kind of rationality, a particular kind of legitimacy, and a particular kind of social action. So I'll put the same problem another way. What Weber understands about political orders is that they always consolidate the various elements of political life: power, violence, authority, legitimacy, rule. They always consolidate all of those elements as systems or structures. And this consolidation is what allows domination to operate in a relatively automatic way. So what distinguishes domination from, say, mere oppression is that we are dominated by a particular order of things, where violence and rule and authority and legitimacy are all integrated. We're dominated by them, but in a fairly automatic way. It doesn't require an explicit saying every day of what we're supposed to obey and how we're supposed to act. So just to put this from the other side of the picture, for Weber, domination always identifies social action that is rather routine and automatic. So for capitalism, for example, which he understands as a structure of domination, what he says is you need a free market, of course, but you also need police, law, certain order of policy, administration, and legitimacy. All of those things are needed to make us into good capitalist subjects. The market doesn't do that by itself. So domination is, for Weber, a structure of subordination and obedience that's sustained by a variety of elements and instruments which are roughly integrated with one another. There will always be an administrative and legal dimension to an order of domination, something that systematizes and orders the whole. There always will be a form of authority and rationality, something that legitimates the whole. And Weber says there will always be an element of violence, even if it's routinized violence, even if it's the presence of the cop on the corner not actually acting violence. That is for him the element of violence in the order that would go into gear in a violent way if somebody acted in a disorderly way. So there's something that always delivers dire consequences for disobedience or refusal. Okay, so just to say, I'm just saying the same thing over and over again in different ways so you get it. Domination for Weber exceeds the mere will of power. Power is a thing that has will in it. It exceeds the mere act of violence. It exceeds the mere truth quality of authority and the mere rationality that underscores every kind of action. It integrates all of these. Now, last week we also saw how Weber's understanding of peculiarly modern forms of domination, and he names two that are especially important to him: capitalism and the bureaucratic state. We saw how his understanding of peculiarly modern forms of domination are built or animated by what he calls instrumental rationality, that freest form of political action, because it does not consult custom or authority or tradition or God or anything else. But that even though both capitalism and the bureaucratic state are built out of instrumental rationality, they come to dominate us in the most comprehensive way that has ever been the case on the face of the earth. They come to dominate not just the worker or the client of a bureaucracy, they even come to dominate the ruler, the bureaucratic administrator, and so forth. We are all cogs in their machinery, in Weber's understanding. And last time we studied why that comes to be. We're not going to review that today, but the point is that for Weber, modern forms of domination really do operate as a machinery that takes all of us with it in the machine, and they overtake all other forms of power and authority and rule, and to boot, they empty the world of meaning, of other values. We simply, they literally destroy other meanings, other values, other than themselves. Okay, so that reviews and amplifies a bit from where we left off last Tuesday. Toward the end of lecture, we begin to consider a distinctive form of authority that especially fascinates Weber, charismatic authority, which is what he will pose as a possible counter to this world totally dominated by the bureaucratic state, running on its instrumentally rational wheels, and capitalism in which we've all become cogs in its ends. So Weber's going to pose as a counter to those modes of domination charismatic leadership. Not mass uprising, not revolution, but a leader who works apart from the machine and sets out values that are other than the non-values of instrumental rationality as they're perpetrated by capitalism and bureaucracy. So Weber's going to set out charismatic leadership as both that which has the capacity to literally inspire or lead mass society, but also has a cause, a purpose, a value, sets out a cause and a purpose and a value, which is precisely what modern forms of domination are destroying. Okay, so that's the backdrop, and now we need to go into a little more detail about what's so distinctive about charismatic authority itself. So now I'm moving into part 2. What's distinctive about charismatic authority for Weber is that it's a claim to authority that is at odds with the basis of legitimacy in any established institutionalized order. That is, while Weber says charisma can be routinized, the moment that it is routinized, the moment that it is institutionalized, its charisma begins to drain out of it. Put another way, charisma is the form of authority, the form of action that will begin to recede or vanish in the face of domination. It can't harden into lasting institutions. Now, this means that in some sense, the charismatic leader is always something of a revolutionary, not necessarily a left-wing revolutionary, and not necessarily a revolutionary who plans to lead a revolution. Rather, in some way, the charismatic leader is always setting herself or himself in opposition, conscious opposition, to some established aspects of the society in which that person is working. Even if it's just in opposition to the Washington viewpoint, or even if it's just in opposition to politics as it's ordinarily conceived. The charismatic leader represents emancipation from routine, from everydayness, even from the present. It always has what we might call today, for Weber, a spiritual dimension. And it always has something of a vision. Now, this already tells you, Weber's not describing charisma as we might talk about it today, like, oh, Johnny Depp has charisma. That's not what his point is. His point is about a very specific kind of charismatic authority or leadership that isn't simply, kind of attractive and appealing, but is leading somewhere. So he's stipulating the definition of charisma in this way. Importantly, charisma is never merely procedural or administrative. It can't be. It's always going somewhere. It's leading somewhere. And this is the feature of it that is crucial to understanding why Weber seeks to resuscitate it in the modern age. The modern age, he knows, is killing it. He knows that rational legal authority and contemporary forms of bureaucratic domination are not generating it and are not particularly appreciative of it. He also knows that the modern period is so bound to rational legal justifications of things. We always want to know procedure and have transparency and so forth, that we're ambivalent at best about charisma, if not, frankly, suspicious of it a lot of the time. But he understands it as the only serious counterforce to politics by administration, bureaucracy, and machine. But we'll take that up shortly. Now, he also understands that in the modern age, there's huge pressure toward just converting charismatic authority into rational legal authority as quickly as possible. And one could think about Obama in this respect. The possibility that what appeared as a charismatic leader on the horizon, once placed in office, couldn't draw on that, couldn't use that, but rather had to become a deal maker, compromiser, administrator of various sorts. What Weber knows is that the press in the modern age is always going to be toward authority and leadership that's grounded in transparency and knowable rules and procedures, law, policy, what he calls rational legal authority. Problem for him is that as much as he understands why rational legal authority has come to dominate in our age, it doesn't have the inventive, revolutionary, world-making qualities of charismatic leadership. So we have to kind of keep this tension in mind as we move into the essay on politics, and also the one we'll be treating on Thursday on science. This tension is that on the one hand, Weber has a profound appreciation of the magical, irrational, non-routinized force of charisma in politics and in life generally. He knows that what he calls our godheads, our ultimate values, aren't derived in a fully rational way. They come from some other source, and they must come from some other source. So we have his appreciation of the magical, irrational, non-routinized force of charisma and of what he calls godheads more generally. And on the other hand, we have in Weber an absolute commitment to science as objectivity, to order and systematization in knowledge and in politics. We have an absolute commitment to all the things he refers to as disenchanting the world, taking the magic out of the world, reducing everything in the world to what is knowable, calculable, deployable, instrumentally useful. His commitment in the second move is to things that will ultimately kill charismatic authority and even eliminate our very desire for it. So we have to keep that tension in mind. It's a tension in Weber, but he thinks it's a tension in our modern world, that our modern world has come to celebrate enlightenment, reason, science, objectivity, as it rightly should, but that very affirmation, that very celebration is slowly killing the very possibility of values themselves. Okay, now in Politics as a Vocation, Weber considers charisma not so much in relationship to its followers, like why are we attracted to it or how does it work on us, but rather he considers it, as he hasn't considered it in any of his other work, in relationship to what he calls its inner components. What's it made of? Now he's doing something weird here, because he's trying to discern something of the composition of a quality that can't be reduced to rational elements. He knows that charismatic leadership, has something of an ineffable quality, an indescribable and ungraspable, unmasterable quality. Can't be reduced to its elements. It can't be objectified, can't be studied systematically by science, but Weber, the scientist, is nonetheless going to try to do his best to do so. But he has to try to grasp its content for a particular reason. He has to try to figure out how to explain to us or to his audience what it is about charismatic leadership that is different on the one hand from a leader of an administrative machine, what would be the best, what we would call today maybe a policy wonk, and on the other hand, how to distinguish it from what he calls a revolutionary who has the quality of excitation, of glamour, that is not really a serious, sober, responsible, charismatic figure. So he's trying to draw a very particular portrait of the charismatic figure, the charismatic politician, who can seriously contest with the machinery on the one side, but not simply go over to a kind of romantic political fervor on the other that he considers to be dangerous and destructive. He's going to stake the future of real political leadership and action on the charismatic figure. So he has to give it some criteria. He has to define it with some precision. But I'm trying to give you a heads up that even as he's sounding like he's defining it in a fairly objective way, he's also defining it in a way that suits his particular anxieties about what our political world is and what the dangers are in it. So charisma, he tells us on page 79, and this is just one sentence, but I will be going into the text a bit later. He tells us on 79 is the root of the idea of a calling in its highest expression. What a weird sentence. The root of the idea of a calling, a vocation, in its highest expression. All right, so charisma comes from a calling, or has one of its key elements as being called to something. And it consists further, he says, of inner determination and inner restraint. Inner determination and inner restraint. Both of those elements at once. Determination, really fierce, passionate determination, as we will see, and restraint. He's going to combine those. These are going to be key for him in drawing the figure of the ideal or charismatic political leader. Now, first, let's contrast this idea of a calling for the charismatic leader with rational, legal, or traditional leadership. Neither rational, legal authority or leadership, nor traditional leadership, simply ascending to the throne or being at the head of the tribe or anything else like that. Neither of them are necessarily driven by a calling. The leader doesn't arise because she or he, it's really all he's for Weber, so I'm just going to now give in. Is another one with really interesting stuff there, because he's very conscious, very, very self-conscious, actually, about a certain masculinity appropriate to politics. And also he's aware of the tragedy in that, but that's another class. So for Weber, he says that the only the charismatic leader, as opposed to the rational legal authority type or the traditional leader, only the charismatic leader lives for his cause and strives for his work. Lives for his cause and strives for his work. So again, we're not just talking about some random charismatic figure here. Charisma defined as just being unbelievably appealing to other people. It's defined as living for one's calling, one's vocation. So not the run-of-the-mill charismatic politician. One might, Obama, Romney, whoever, you can pick out the ones who have some of that. But somebody more like, it's tricky here. Well, let's just go to one that will be fairly uncontroversial. Nelson Mandela. Somebody who truly lives for the cause and strives for it. Why? Why is this so important to Weber? Because on some level, it sounds like he's just describing somebody who's fairly obsessed. But it's not that. Weber is trying to make a distinction between those who truly live for politics and a political cause. So you have to live for politics in his understanding and for a particular cause. He's trying to distinguish those people from the many who simply, as he puts it, live off of politics. So a distinction between those who live for it and those who live off of it. What's at stake here? What Weber knows is that in the contemporary order of things, almost the vast majority of those in politics in one way or another, from staffers to administrators to EPA heads to UN functionaries, whatever, most of the people in politics live off of it. That is, they literally make their living off of it. It's their job. due to the sheer number of administrators and officials bureaucrats really, involved in politics, party politics, political administrations, political organizations, and so forth. But this is also due to what we learned from Tocqueville to understand as the kind of growing equality of conditions, where more and more people in political life are in it as middle-class folks or roughly middle class, and need the work. Now, what Weber is up against here, as Tocqueville was, as Mill was, continuing this theme right into the 20th century, is the problem of a disappearing, or now disappeared, educated, leisured political class. Why is this so important to Weber? He's searching for a cadre of political actors, an order of possible people in politics whose private interests won't drive their public interests. And we saw that in Tocqueville, and we saw that in Mill, and we saw that in others. So Weber, like them, wants politicians whose own economic security and well-being doesn't depend upon politics. Partly, he just wants them not to be bribable. But he also wants those who are learned and educated and far-seeing and public-minded, who aren't concerned with their own well-being or wealth, who don't need to feather their own nests. Paradoxically, that means they must be wealthy enough to be able to not have to worry about anything other than their political cause. Now, Weber is a smart guy, and he knows that that's a problem. He knows that wealthy people will come to politics with their own interests. But what he's trying to do is detach involvement in political life from the literal question of livelihood. He wants vocation, the vocation for politics, the calling to politics, to be distinguished from job. He wants it to be a calling, an end, a thing you really passionately care about, what we today call a public servant. It's hard for us to even say the word without just seeing it as a form of life like any other job. But he really wants it not to be a need, not to be an interest, not to be a means, but to just be an end unto itself. And remember, from what you've already learned about Weber, it's really hard to have that in the modern time, where everything has been submitted to instrumental rationality. So politics has to be a calling, an end, rather than a need or an interest or a means. And however much the wealthy might bring certain concerns and interests to politics derived from their class standing, he's thinking that won't be the driving aim. He was wrong, but I also think one needs to think about the difference between sort of where he's standing in the early part of the 20th century and our own time. Okay, so one thing we know is that he's trying to push the need for income out of the picture and distinguish the true politician from the paid official. You see that laid out in detail on page 95. But he's also trying to distinguish the true leader, the true politician, from all the other employees in political life in a number of other ways. He says, for example, the political official, engages in impartial administration, doesn't fight or question, simply obeys and carries out duties. For the politician, the job is, as he puts it, to take a stand, to be passionate in his element. Those are Weber's words. And to be personally responsible for every single thing he does. Now, Weber thinks both officials and political leaders are important in political life, but he's trying to get them separated. He thinks mixing them is a disaster. If you mix them, you end up politicizing administration, which he thinks is terrible. And on the other side, you reduce political leadership to the ethos of the official, someone who stands up and gives accounts of things according to timelines or things that have gone right or things that have gone wrong, rather than really standing up and taking full responsibility for whatever they did and didn't do. And for the most part, he thinks this mixture of officialdom with politics is the fate of our age. It's what's made politics unattractive, in his view. It's what's produced what he understands machine politics to be all about. It's what he understands democracy more generally to have produced. What Weber details in the first two-thirds of the essay is all the things about contemporary political conditions that deter the cultivation of politics as a vocation, politics for true charismatic leaders. He concludes on 114, there's no bright future for politics as a vocation. Why? Because politics is so bureaucratized, so commercialized, so corrupt, but also because of the effect of mass parties, the masses themselves. Essentially, the loss of a class available for political life and the loss of the very value of political life in modern democracy. But then, against all of these odds, Weber turns back to his developing portrait of the ideal political leader and starts to try to fill in that portrait. Now, before we go further, I want to note something about the difficulty of vocabulary here and the way it expresses something that Weber's up against. We don't have a good word for what Weber is trying to describe in the charismatic political actor. He's trying to describe a sober, mature devotee to a worthwhile and passionate political cause. So a sober, mature devotee to a worthwhile and passionate political cause, and who also is willing to lead on behalf of that cause and be a visionary for it. We don't have a word for this. If we say what Weber's describing is his ideal politician, we run into the fact that the word politician is a largely degraded term today. It's largely suffused with negativity, or at least negative connotations. If we use the language of political leader, we either are up against the fact that the degraded conditions of politics make us not really believe in political leaders, or we're up against a democratic conceit, which is that we don't like to think of ourselves as being led, because leaders imply followers. So politician doesn't work for what he's talking about. Political leader doesn't work for what he's talking about. Political activist, it's too zealous for what it sounds too zealous, not sober enough, not responsible enough for what Weber is after. Political actor tends to make us think of Berlusconi or Ronald Reagan or other moments of high performance in politics. Connotes our suspicion that politics is largely acting in the theatrical sense. We don't hear the word action in the term. Rather, we tend to think of the staged event where the backdrop is planned, the speech is highly scripted, and so forth. So I'm running through this vocabulary difficulty because it's really important to bear it in mind as you read the last third of Weber's text. He's trying to conjure something he believes is almost lost to history, that is almost gone as a possibility from modernity. And if our very political lexicon is an indicator of the possible, we've literally lost the language to try to conjure what Weber is drawing. The dignified, responsible, largely egoless, but visionary, passionate, insistent political leader. That's what he's trying to draw. We can point perhaps to some examples. I named Mandela, maybe Martin Luther King, maybe Cesar Chavez, Gandhi, Desmond Tutu. What's telling is none of them were actually in positions of political power in an official sense. And Weber, at the very beginning of the essay, tells you the political is today largely confined to the state, so we're talking about people in or leading the state. Okay, now we need to turn a little more directly to this portrait that he's trying to draw. We're going to turn to this phrase that he uses, the warm passion and cool sense of proportion that he's trying to put together in the ideal political figure. We need to start with what Weber tells us makes politics worth entering at all. So I'm going to read from the very top of page 115. He asks us, after he's talked about all the reasons that politics is such a drag for thoughtful, intelligent leaders today, why would one enter it in the first place? What are the inner enjoyments, he asks, that this career can offer? And he says at the top of 115, well, first of all, the career of politics grants a feeling of power. The knowledge of influencing men, participating in power over them, and above all, the feeling of holding in one's hands a nerve fiber of historically important events. Okay, a feeling of power, a knowledge of influencing men, participating in power over them, and holding a nerve fiber of history in one's hand. This is really the key motivation. The political actor worthy of the name, in Weber's understanding, must desire this kind of power, not just domination over others, not just the thrill of being in office, but having power over the course of history itself. It's this turn from power or rule to control over the course of events more generally that also is going to shape the demands on a political actor. It's going to, as we see, mark the turn from simply having power and using power to having to be responsible. It's also going to distinguish the worthy political actor from the merely egotistical or vain or dangerous one. Watch as Weber, over the next few pages after he's introduced this idea, makes clear just how difficult it is to fashion this kind of character. He says the political actor must be passionately devoted to a cause, not just to his own grandiosity or narcissism, and must deeply believe in something and devote his entire being to it. But at the same time, he says, this passion must be tempered with what he calls a sense of proportion, or what he elsewhere describes as distance to things and men. So he's describing a passion for a cause that must not focus or fix on immediate objects, immediate individuals, trying to triumph over particular people or win particular campaigns. It must be a passion that is located in an aim that exceeds anything very immediate or local and is tempered by a profound sense of proportion. Now, Weber knows this isn't the nature of passion. Indeed, from Tocqueville to Bentham to Freud to Nietzsche, what we've learned about passion in this course, at least in political life, is that it's the distinctly human energy form and it's oriented to personal gratification. Passion is oriented to interests that satisfy the ego or satisfy the appetite, or feeling one's raw strength and power in the world. From Nietzsche, from Freud, from some others we've learned, it tends to be antisocial or destructive or both. Every theorist that we've examined has either been inclined to try to harness passion with reason or suppress it with civilizational chains, or reserve it for the few whose noble passions might create grand things, as Nietzsche thought. Weber's trying to do something different with passion. He's trying to get it to move to this more abstract, more far-seeing domain, trying to channel it into a cause that is large and worthwhile, not to suppress it or even supplement it with reason, but to balance it with some other elements. Look at the very bottom of page 115. He says, politics is about 5-6 lines from the bottom. Politics is made with the head, not with the other parts of the body or soul. So politics is made with the head. And yet, devotion to politics, if it's not to be frivolous intellectual play, but genuinely human conduct, can be born and nourished from passion alone. So the danger in politics isn't passion itself, it's rather frivolous intellectual play, tinkering with rhetoric or policy or partisanship or law. And yet what Weber's doing here, this effort to rally passion for a large, worthwhile cause, is no easy task. Because a cause that is large and in scope and long in attainment is not the natural form for passion. Making politics one's life work, therefore, requires, in Weber's understanding, being able to distance oneself from the ego gratification that passion normally demands. It means routing passion away from its natural course. Let's put this a little differently. Distance to things and men, which is the phrase he uses, means the actor actually trying to take a little distance from himself, even as he's passionate. Acquiring, as Weber puts it, habituation to detachment in every sense of the word. So what have we got? He wants a passionate creature who's also detached. The actor has to have passion, but has to be somewhat detached from it. What's Weber looking for? What's he trying to incite? He's trying to incite something where passion is where we have passion, but where its wellspring is the raw instinct for power or for a cause merging with another element. And the way he puts it at the very bottom of 115 is this: how can warm passion and a cool sense of proportion be forged together in one and the same soul? Those are the two elements that he's trying to put together: warm passion and a cool sense of proportion. So look at what he's done. The second element to passion is not mere reason or coolness. It will turn out to be a sense of proportion and, above all, responsibility. If he just had passion tempered with reason, what would the problem be? Reason, he knows, would only add instrumental rationality to the passion. It would just make passion really calculating. He spent years of his life studying that problem. And that would lead not to something great, but to something totally unethical, totally calculating. So what's needed right now is not reason as the counterbalance to passion, but an ethics of proportionality and responsibility. Let me put this problem slightly differently. The political actor must love power. That's the medium of politics. That's what draws you into it in the first place. You can't turn against it. He does not criticize political life for having power as its basic currency. That is what political life has. But the political actor must want to use power well and carefully, and must avoid the sin of what he calls vanity. What is vanity for Weber? It stands for the moment when the power instinct overrides the cause. Remember, this political actor has devotion to a cause, but also has to have a love of power. And if that love of power starts to override the cause, then personal gratification is going to overtake devotion to an external purpose. Okay, stay with this point for just a little longer, because it stretches what we usually imagine can go together. What's really interesting here is that what Weber invokes as the instrument with which this battle between having to have a power instinct but not have it overtake the devotion to a cause, the instrument that he invokes to be able to achieve that is, of all things, objectivity. Let's look at page 116 and see what he has to say here. I'm at 116, second full paragraph, about 10 lines down from the middle. The sin against the lofty spirit Well, let me start okay. With the politician, he works with the striving for power as an unavoidable means. That's what you do. Therefore, power instinct, as it usually is said, belongs indeed to his normal qualities. The sin against the lofty spirit of his vocation, however, begins where this striving for power ceases to be objective and becomes purely personal self-intoxication, instead of exclusively entering the service of the cause. So what's he trying to do? He's trying to get this power instinct, this desire for power, this love of power, to be entirely focused on the cause, rather than becoming something that simply buoys up the actor himself. For ultimately, he continues, there are only two kinds of deadly sins in the field of politics: lack of objectivity, and often but not always identical with it, irresponsibility. Vanity, the need personally to stand in the foreground as clearly as possible, strongly tempts the politician to commit one or both of these sins. So objectivity is what pulls the actor out of that kind of subjective absorption with self, with power, with passion, with the desire for gratification, and we could also say today, narcissism. Objectivity is what pulls the actor back into the world, rendering one's desire for power an object in the world, something that can be known and judged, pursued with care, mitigates the natural tendency in politicians to aggrandize themselves. And he knows it's a natural tendency because they love power. And so that means they're going to get intoxicated by it. And he's trying to figure out how to temper that. There's nothing natural about this objectivity, making one's cause something that one knows to be an object in the world and displaces attention from self to the object. It has to be striven for. It has to be achieved against all odds. So what drives the actor, the power instinct, can't be given full rein, can't even be allowed to dominate. Okay, I want to turn finally to the ethics that I've been hinting at, the ethics of responsibility. That is really the final and resounding conclusion of this essay. Because it's a distinctive ethics. It's an ethics that Weber thinks is distinctive to politics. It's only for politics, and it is all that will make politics itself ethical. To get here, we have to again return to some of the tensions in political life. One of them is set in motion by the very nature of action. And it is this. Weber understands that there is a potentially huge gap between an actor's intention, the action, and the effect. That is, the theme here is as old as Machiavelli, who warned against taking intentions too seriously because politics is full of contingency and always transforms one's intentions. It was also set by Nietzsche. Remember in the second essay of The Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche said the cause of an origin of a thing and its eventual utility, its actual employment, lie worlds apart. What becomes of something cannot be traced back to its intention. Weber has his own understanding of what he calls the tragedy of action. Look on page 117, the first full paragraph. Weber says this: the final result of political action often, no even regularly, stands in completely inadequate and often even paradoxical relation to its original meaning. So the final result of a political action may stand in completely inadequate and often paradoxical relationship to its original meaning. What's he trying to get at? That a good political actor must understand that intentions are not what matter. What matters is what happens. And therefore, one must hew to what Weber calls an ethic of responsibility in politics, rather than an ethic of ends. I'm going to specify both of these. Let me start by giving an example. Weber is saying to us, it is not acceptable in politics to say, well, I did this for the cause, too bad it didn't work out, or a lot of people died, or it backfired, or the war didn't really accomplish the ends we were hoping it would accomplish, or this policy didn't really achieve the anti-poverty effects we were hoping for. I did it for the cause. My hands are clean. I was trying to do the right thing, and whoops. To say that you did it for the right reasons even if it didn't work out is to operate in a sphere other than politics. It's to ignore the facts of political life, the fundamental conditions of politics, which is a condition in which aims are forever being transformed into effects that may betray them. You need to know that if you're going to be a political actor, and you need to take responsibility for it. Politics is an action-based order. It's a dynamic order. You can't stand here and say, my intentions were good, I don't bear any responsibility for what happened after that. Responsibility to Weber means being responsible to the effects that you set in motion. And it means caring about those effects. It means living in history and in the political medium, even if you yourself didn't produce those conditions. And it means knowing that actors don't retain control over their actions, but are still responsible for what they set in motion. Okay, so here we're in another one of those tensions, which is that the political actor has to have passion about a cause, but must be attentive to all that might issue from acting to bring about the object of your passion. Okay, so the first tension that sets the condition for the ethics of responsibility that Weber is after has to do with the fact that politics is a realm of action, and that it's dynamic, and that you're not fully in control of everything, but that you need to know that very fact and be responsible to that very fact to be an ethical actor within it. The second tension pertains also to the way Weber defines politics, and that has to do with the medium or the means of politics, which Weber says bluntly is violence. The fact that power generally and violence in particular are so fundamental to the order of politics intensifies the paradox of action that we've just talked about. Because what Weber says is, no matter what the cause, and no matter what your own principles are, you must recognize that politics is a domain that has as its currency and an ineluctable element, the element of violence, of force. It's not simply ordered by ideals or laws or rules or visions. It's a realm of violence, not only of justice. And you, the would-be political actor, have to be attending constantly to that fact. You cannot simply stand for peace or truthfulness. You can stand for those things, but you can't stand for them without bearing responsibility for the violence or the suffering that your stand for peace or truthfulness might unleash. Weber's challenge to the pacifist, or to the one who is simply committed to truth-telling above all, is that there will be blood on your hands too. Pacifism amidst war has bloody consequences. That doesn't make it wrong. It means that you also are implicated. Truth-telling amidst struggle also has consequences. It will unleash passions. It may unleash violence. It may produce death. To be clear here, Weber is not saying you can't be moral in politics. He is saying that the morality, or more precisely, the ethics appropriate to politics, must reckon with the medium in which it operates. It must be one that bears responsibility for action where the consequences may be beyond your intention, and it must bear responsibility for the fact that the domain is a domain that includes violence. Now, to an ethic of responsibility, which I'm going to fill out just a bit more in a minute, but we're starting to get it developed already, Weber contrasts what he calls an ethic of absolute ends. And an ethic of absolute ends, where you're simply committed to the end and everything you do is ethically justified by the end, refuses the very recognitions that I have just been describing. So first, let's see what Weber means by an ethic of absolute ends. And here we need to subdivide a little bit. He has two ways of describing an ethic of absolute ends. One is to call it an absolute ethic, and the other is to call it an ethic of ultimate ends. And they're just a little bit different. They blur together at times, but they're actually two distinct critiques he's making here. And they move to different parts of the problem of political action. So let's first go to what he calls the absolute ethic. What is an absolute ethic, and why does he hate it so? It's a principle, like pacifism or isolationism or libertarianism, absolute commitment to individual liberty, that fails to reckon with the constitutive conditions of politics. It's the installation of a moral principle, especially a moral principle of behavior, in a realm where particular political conditions will transform what that principle means or does. To attach to an absolute ethic is to live, in his view, abstracted from political life. It's to refuse to bear responsibility for the consequences that might unfold from your attachment to this principle. It's to try to have clean hands in politics, and he thinks there is no such thing. So that's the absolute ethic. The ethic of ends, and what he dislikes about it, is a little bit different. It's a commitment to a cause without any modulation by responsibility. That cause might be socialism, or an Islamic or Jewish state, or something else. You just name the cause. And in some ways, it's the opposite problem from the problem of the absolute ethic, because here, the end will justify any means. Before, one was simply, in the first case, in the case of the absolute ethic, one was simply committed to a particular mode of conduct. I will be a pacifist no matter what. In the second case, the end, in his view, justifies any means, whatever it takes to achieve the cause. However many millions might die, however many others might be sacrificed, whatever oppression might be entailed, you will keep the flame burning for the cause, and it will be justified by the cause, and the cause will justify anything that goes down in its name. And since, as he keeps reminding us, the decisive means for politics is violence, this kind of ethic is particularly dangerous in politics, because no amount of bloodshed is too much for it. He concludes his diatribe against an ethic of ultimate ends by claiming that it tends to do two things. Its adherents, he says, turn into chiliastic prophets. They'll justify whatever happens in the course of reaching the promised land by the guarantee that it will be reached. And he claims that there's no possibility of being responsible when one has an ethic of absolute ends. He says on page 122, I'll just read to you quickly, if one makes any concessions at all to the principle that the end justifies the means, it's not possible to bring an ethic of ultimate ends and an ethic of responsibility under one roof. He also adds that those who adhere to an ethic of absolute ends, no matter what the cause is worthwhile, no matter what happens along the way, he says that adherents of this ethic adhere to a fairy tale belief, and the belief is crucial because we all have it a little bit, that from good only good can come, and from evil only evil follows. So we believe that as long as we are committed to our cause, that we are always good and everybody else committed to the cause is good and everybody against it is evil. He calls that a fairy tale or infantile belief because it retreats from the realities of the world. He sees it as terribly dangerous and ultimately kind of anti-political. It's a kind of otherworldly belief. He concludes, anyone who enters politics contracts with diabolical powers. Anyone who enters politics contracts with diabolical powers. Why? Because the medium of politics is power and is violence. And you have to know that from the beginning, and you have to give up the idea that your values will ever be their own justification. Okay, so what do we have in this figure of the charismatic leader or politician that Weber is drawing? Initially, simply to set it against the machine, the order of domination that he thinks is our contemporary order. We now see that he's also trying to give us a particular ethic, a particular way of particular mode of conduct for political life, for the political actor that is distinctive to it. He has drawn, indeed, I think, a quite formidable figure, one that's very, very distant from the methodical, submissive, calculating functionary, or one that's quite different as well from the political actor who just is in it for the vanity and the gratification. Let's summarize what he's given us. This figure is one who is deeply compelled by a set of political beliefs or values, has a vision, and works tirelessly on earth to realize that vision. And yet, this is also someone who never, ever ceases to attend to the context, the costs of this pursuit. We have a person who will shoulder responsibility for every action, no matter how unintended the consequences, no matter what twist of fate he faces. He has given us a figure who loves the excitement of working in the domain of power, who wants power, who wants to be shaping history, yet who does not gratify himself at that trough. We have a figure who is excited by power, who is drawn to power, who wants to hold power in his hands, but tries to craft something for the world there, not for himself. When Weber sees politicians or political actors or political leaders or whatever we're going to call them in our inadequate vocabulary for this, simply gratifying their own interests or their own egos, he knows already the cause is lost. He has also given us a picture of a figure who is deeply ethical, but not in a pious way, not in an inner worldly way, not in a moralizing sense, and not to save his own soul. That is not the point. The ethics this person cultivates are the ethics appropriate to the treacherous domain in which he operates. A domain in which the contingency and the dynamism of action keeps shifting conditions, and where power and violence are the currency of the field. And he has given us a figure who has, in his view, passion and perspective, who has conviction and a certain objectivity. And above all, one who, as he puts it at the very conclusion, doesn't crumple when, and I'm quoting, the world seems too stupid or too base for what he has to offer. Somebody who's in for the long haul, no matter what the disappointments. So I want to conclude by just posing a couple of questions. There are many more to pose than the ones I'm posing. We need to come out of an appreciation of what Weber has drawn here to ask, what are the political implications of his particular formulation of the right bearing for politics? What has he done by stipulating politics as being entirely about the state, entirely about leadership, entirely about this kind of sober political hero? Let's put it in a Nietzschean way. What are the politics of this politics? What's the value of this value? And of course, we also need to ask about the relationship between The figure Weber has drawn by the end of the essay, this responsible, sober, passionate, ethical human being, what's the relationship between that figure and the charisma with which we begin? What's charismatic about this creature? Why would this particular figure be appealing to others? What's the relationship between this kind of sober, responsible, somewhat objective, coolly passionate creature and the demagoguery that Weber also identifies as crucial to political success? Or put another way, what's the possibility of this figure actually ascending in politics and surviving in politics? What kind of ideal has Weber crafted? And what's the relationship of that ideal to what actually can survive and thrive in politics? Okay, let me stop there and take your questions about any aspect of this essay. Which you almost certainly will be writing about soon. Yes?
When you talk about violence, can it just be anything that someone doesn't necessarily agree with? Like, what kind of violence is he referring to?
That's a great question. So when Weber says violence is fundamental in politics, or it's the currency of politics, is he really talking about like physical violence, like police violence or military violence, or is he also talking about other kinds of force? I think he's talking about both, but I think he's especially concerned with overt violence. I think he's really, in many ways, this lecture can be seen as a lesson to young radicals. And he's addressing a lot of leftists in his audience who he thinks are very attracted to socialism at his time, and who he thinks will sign on for violent revolution in the name of the cause to bring about justice and peace and goodness and fairness and economic well-being on earth. And I think that part of what he's doing in this essay is issuing a warning to them about what they could potentially unleash. That said, what's great about your question is that I think he's also trying to say that everything in politics has an element of violence or force in it. So we could even just be talking about deciding to deflate currency and what that unleashes in a country when deflation of currency might be done in relationship to the need for changing the rate of exchange internationally, but might simply destroy the livelihoods of a large portion of the population. He doesn't say that. I'm extrapolating a little bit, but I think it's available in Weber, that other kind of violence, that worry about the kind of large consequences for the very survivability of a people or persons. And then I think he's also, as you hinted at, I think talking about whatever is required to force people to do certain things, whether it's legal sanctions or other kinds of policing or discipline or power. So just to wrap up, I do think he's talking about what we immediately think of when we hear the word violence, both domestically and internationally, but I think his point is available at these other levels of violence. Does that get at your question? Yes? Not quite. He's actually looking for the possibility of cultivating the qualities of leadership from the description that he's offering from those who are already drawn to politics. So another way to read what he's doing in terms of his audience, remembering that this is a lecture, is that he's saying, look, you who are so passionate about politics, you who are so willing and eager to become involved in politics, great that you want to do that, but remember, this is what you hold as your responsibility. So I don't think it's so much that he's invoking or hoping for, the figure of the messianic outsider, as he is trying to say to people drawn to political life and eager to climb in political life, here's what you're drawn to. Here's what the stakes are. Here's what this field looks like. Here's what it consists of. It's got power and violence as its medium. It's got the contingency of action as its fundamental nature. And if you are to be responsible and ethical in it, you must be passionate, you must have a cause, but you also must be consummately sober and mature and responsible. And so I think it's more a lecture to already politically motivated or politically invested human beings whom he's trying to get to grow up. Your question, however, raises the issue of whether and why Nazism would see Weber as a friend. That is, as describing something that might be a Mussolini or a Hitler or something like that. And it's up to us to sort of parse the essay carefully and see whether or not we think that's accurate. I know that's not quite what you were aiming at, but go ahead. Did you want to follow up?
You described how this ideal figure has a vision, and to me it's more like a proactive figure. So can this ideal politician not be someone who just maintains a very good status quo?
Okay, it's a great question. So why does this charismatic leader have to be going somewhere? Why can't they just be the one who says, we're here, this is it, we've got what we need to preserve it and take care of it? Did I get it right? Because Weber, this is why I set out the context in the beginning, because Weber thinks our danger today is total domination by structures, especially capitalism and the bureaucratic state, that have completely emptied life of meaning and have given us no cause, no sense of justice, no sense of what's worthy, no sense of a common project other than capital accumulation on the one hand and rule-abiding orderliness on the other. Charisma doesn't go there. I mean, so one answer to your question is a charismatic leader simply isn't there to administer what is already mechanically unfolding before us. But the second and bigger answer is Weber himself has a cause, and the cause is to make us other than cogs in that machinery. He is trying to figure out how political life can be a source of redemption from simply being administered cogs in bureaucratic and capitalist life. And so that's what that vision is about. Somebody who just says, it's okay, we're here, let's all just be rule-abiding capitalist specks of human capital and just put our heads down and do our thing, is both incommensurate with what Weber himself wants and is out of line with what he thinks charisma always is, which is always to set itself apart from that automatic machinery of a structure of domination. Does that get at your question? Okay. Ignore them. We still have a few more minutes. I'm sorry. Thank you, Mark. Go ahead.
Sort of related to the last question, but what's the role of Christianity in the way that he shapes this, and in particular, thinking about where the source of values are?
That's great. Okay, so on the one hand, Weber is continuing a long tradition now that we've been seeing really since the class before this, Machiavelli, of being anxious about the play of Christianity in politics. You'll note in this essay lots of worries about a Christian ethics in political life. It's not going to do the job. He's worried about, he says, the Sermon on the Mount is just fine for some things. It's useless in politics. You can't turn the other cheek. You have to resist evil. That's the job of political life and so forth. But also he understands that it's a passive and or pacifist ethics, which is, of course, at odds with what it's actually been historically, but that's what he understands the ethics to be. So he's antagonistic to a Christian ethics as the structure of ethics in politics. It just doesn't comport well with it. It doesn't help you deal with the contingency of action, power, violence, etc. But I think your question is also a question about whether Christianity could produce the cause that one is devoted to. Is that correct? Like, the realization of Christian vision on earth. Technically, I think Weber would not object to that. He says you can't arbitrate causes. You can't say to somebody, this is a good cause, this is a bad cause. We can have arguments about that, but he knows that the cause itself is finally something that will emerge organically from the charismatic leader and people who will or won't follow it. But he doesn't give us much of a sense of Christianity as being the source of that object. And if we want a hint at what he does think is valuable, it is things like the glory of the state, the power and the greatness of the modern state, what in international relations we call the prestige of the state. But it also, and he does value this, it could be a cause that has to do with justice, as long as it's doesn't take that messianic form. So there you could say, okay, a Christian vision might have a vision of justice, and he'll even let socialist notion crawl in there as a possible Christian vision, as long as, again, it doesn't become an end in which any means are legitimated, and also as long as the vision itself reckons with the fact that power will never disappear from politics. So let me just finish with this point. His suspicion of both Christianity and socialism, and even what he considers to be something of their kinship, is that they imagine finally a world without power. His view, not mine. His view is that they imagine finally a world in which we are all brothers and sisters and aren't dealing with violence and power as our ongoing condition, and aren't dealing with the questions of interest and agonism as our ongoing political condition. And so while he won't say flat out, socialism is bunk for that reason, he comes awfully close if you read this carefully. And I think Christianity as a politics is in the same bag. Okay? So we'll do Science as a Vocation on Thursday. We'll have a complete lecture on that day and also do evaluations. See you then. All right. Let's go ahead and begin. The order of business today is that I will give a final lecture on Weber, which will be useful to you in your final take-home essay, and then take your questions, and then we'll do course evaluations. So that's what we're up to today. Okay, so let's go back into Politics as a Vocation and Science as a Vocation, the two lectures that Weber offered to students, and in which he offers both his account of these two domains, politics and science, and also gives you a sense of his own values, what he believes. These are often called, as I said, his vocations essays, but also his value essays. They're the place where he does tell you what he thinks, as opposed to simply presenting what he takes to be scientific knowledge. Last time we explored in Politics as a Vocation the very complex demands that Weber places on the person who would enter political life as a potential leader. The politician, the actor, as two of the GSIs suggested last time, perhaps the right word here is the statesman, that Weber is trying to depict, both in terms of what components make this person appropriate for political life and what ethics they ought to bear. And we saw that Weber places the following kinds of demands on this person. The person must have passion for a cause. The person must have an attraction to power, a taste for political life, which means an attraction to power. But these things have to be tempered, in Weber's view, by a certain egolessness, a sense of perspective, sobriety, and above all, an ethics of responsibility. Just going to turn this up a little bit. This ethics, which we explored last time, the ethics of responsibility, is absolutely the opposite of an instrumentally rational approach to life. So it's an ethics that counters what Weber considers to be the dominant mode of reasoning and the dominant mode of acting in the contemporary age. But this ethic is not just opposite to instrumental rationality, it's also different from other ethics. Ethics that might be appropriate to realms apart from politics, a personal ethics, an ethics in social life, perhaps an ethics in economic conduct, an ethics that one orients one's moral bearing by, but ethics that he considers to be utterly inappropriate to politics. So let's just go back over these briefly. There are two in particular that he really wants to move out of the political realm. One he calls an absolute ethic. What does he mean by this? Some unwavering commitment to a moral principle or a table of values as the guide for all action. So it could be an unwavering commitment to Christianity and what one takes to be Christian morality, or it could be an unwavering commitment to, say, the principle of nonviolence. It could be an unwavering commitment to human rights. What's Weber's objection here? He believes that having this kind of principle or moral commitment as the thing which guides all your action in life misunderstands the complex contextual nature of politics, where your intentions as a human rights activist or as a Christian or as a nonviolent advocate may inadvertently turn into something quite opposite from what you intended, because that's the nature of political life. It's a domain of action and contingency where your intentions don't always add up to the effects that you might have wanted. Put another way, such a commitment refuses the contingency and the unpredictability of the consequences of action. And above all, he believes, such a commitment refuses the specific medium of politics, the medium of violence. So one ethic that he wants to refuse as having an appropriate place in politics is what he calls an absolute ethic, that commitment to an unwavering moral principle. The other one that's related but a little bit different, and it's important to get these two things separated, is what he calls an ethic of ultimate ends. And the ethic of ultimate ends is an ethic in which one is single-mindedly devoted to obtaining a particular future state. Could be absolute democracy, could be socialism, could be absolute peace, could be world harmony, could be a lot of different things. But that future state to which one has a single-minded devotion is what he means by an ultimate end. The problem with this one, he believes, is that it leads its actors who are living under that ethic. I am committed to this end above all, it's all I care about, is that it will lead you to justify any means at all to obtain it. It allows everything in the present to be potential means to that end, and in believing in the goodness of its own aim, it believes that everything that one does in pursuing that aim is good. Now, if Weber thinks that an absolute ethic, the first one, where you have something that simply guides your action at the level of a principle, like, say, nonviolence or pacifism, if he thinks that's a bit naive and responsible, if he thinks that the first one, the absolute ethics, is inappropriate to politics because of the nature of the political domain, he's much less generous with the ethic of ultimate ends. He really hates it. He treats it not simply as naive, but as sinister. It's sinister because it's otherworldly. It literally refuses to dwell in this life and be responsible to these people in this time, in this world, and care for them. And as such, it's dangerous. The one who pursues an ethic of absolute ends, he thinks, will be profoundly unethical in the deployment of that means peculiar to politics, violence. The one who pursues an ethic of ultimate ends, of absolute ends, will be unethical in the deployment of the violence pursued, of the violence deployed in the pursuit of this end. Let's consider some examples. Consider the acronym of one of the groups on campus that's devoted to pursuing affirmative action and social equality. The acronym is BAMN, B-A-M-N, and of course that stands for by any means necessary. So the coalition to fight for affirmative action, social equality, etc., by any means necessary, this is just what Weber is targeting. By any means necessary is for him the most dangerous and irresponsible political position one could take. Another example, these are just examples that we're trying to channel Weber to think about. If say, occupying buildings to protest tuition hikes has the effect of making California voters less sympathetic to UC, less inclined to support the University of California, Weber presumably would say, not only is the tactic ineffective, but it's actually unleashing a certain kind of violence, not only on the buildings, but potentially on the project itself. Now, Weber's charge here can seem like it's mostly against the left, mostly against revolutionary politics, but it is equally applicable to any politics or ethics of ultimate ends. So let's go to the other end of the spectrum. If the second Bush regime went to war in Iraq in the name of spreading democracy, and we're just going to bracket all the other justifications that were given, weapons of mass destruction, etc., just accept that in the end, the justification forwarded was spreading democracy, making life better for people. But if it ended up sacrificing huge numbers of Iraqi and other human lives, if it ended up producing a civil war, if it ended up reducing large portions of Iraqi cities to rubble, and deepened religious factions and fighting, and foiled the possibilities for a peaceful, stable, post-Saddam regime, Weber would say, doesn't matter if your end was spreading democracy. Here are the consequences of the actions. If in addition it ended up generating support for al-Qaeda in the Arab world and establishing al-Qaeda for the first time in Iraq, and if it also destabilized the Middle East more generally and generated unprecedented hostility toward both the US and Europe more generally in the Islamic world, if all this unfolded in the name of spreading democracy or other motives, this encapsulates what Weber means by irresponsibility in politics. The inappropriateness of an ethic of ultimate ends in politics. It's not to say that he thinks you can calculate every outcome. But if that outcome could have been calculated, and indeed many advisors to Bush understood that was all of these ramifications were quite likely, then it doesn't matter if you say, I was simply trying to spread democracy and give people what I thought they wanted and what we thought was good for them. So the point is that Weber's charge here can move from right to left, even though, as we'll see a little bit later in the lecture, he's mostly targeting the left. Then we're left with the question, does Weber suggest, by virtue of challenging the absolute ethic and challenging the ethic of absolute of ends, does he suggest that you simply can't have any visions or ideals in politics? No. Remember, the passion for a cause is at the very heart of what he says is the vocation of the politician or political actor. So what's Weber trying to do? He's trying to marry an ethic of responsibility with this passion. He wants you to have passion for a cause. He wants you to have something you're trying to make come true on this earth. He wants the leader to have as an ambition much more than personal ambition or simply running a smooth state. But it has to be combined with what he calls an ethic of responsibility. He wants the cause to be the driving force and the ethic to be the frame for action. The ethic is that which will draw a line to help one understand what one can and cannot do in the name of the cause. The ethic will help you put the cause in perspective and count everything in this world, this life, this current order as valuable and not sacrificable to some future end. The ethic will enforce, in Weber's understanding, the possibility of pursuing one's passion with care, with patience, with determination. And he sums up this point by referring to politics at the very end of the essay as the slow boring of hard boards. The slow boring of hard boards. It's the age of the hand drill. So he's describing a creature who has enormous passion, enormous investment, but also has the patience and the perspective and the care for this world to be able to understand that whatever the cause, whatever the dream, it has to be pursued with an ethical set of commitments to this time, to this world, and not only to a future ideal. Okay, I want to turn from this, which is in some ways review and amplification of where we were last time, to consider something I mentioned from the beginning, which is the conservatism in Weber that inflects not only his values, but also, as we'll see toward the end, his supposedly scientific knowledge. The questions I ended with last lecture, were these. First, I asked, what's the relationship between the constitutive and ethical dimensions of the political actor that Weber is drawing and the demagoguery that he identifies as crucial to political success? Put another way, what makes the figure, the responsible, sober hero with perspective and willingness to be patient and careful and attentive to consequences, what makes that figure charismatic, attractive, someone that we would all want to follow? Put another way, what's the possibility of this figure actually surviving and thriving in politics? What kind of ideal has Weber crafted of the statesman or political leader? And what's the relationship of that ideal or ideal type to what can actually survive and thrive in contemporary politics? And then finally, I said we want to pursue the question of what are the political implications of the figure that Weber has drawn and the ethics that he has drawn. What are the political implications of this character? Or put succinctly, what are the politics of Weber's politics? What are the politics of Weber's character of the ideal political hero? So let's start with the first question, the relationship between the constitutive and ethical dimensions of the political actor and the demagoguery that he says is essential for political success, or what makes this character charismatic. Is the sober hero charismatic, and can he survive political life? Remember what we learned about charisma last time. Among other things, the charismatic leader is someone who, Weber tells us, is attributed magical powers, is thought to have some magical powers. It's that attribution that creates the authority of the charismatic figure and creates our obedience or willingness to follow that figure. The second thing he said about the charismatic leader is that it's someone who has a vision. It's not an administrator. It's truly a leader. It's somebody truly going somewhere, taking us somewhere. Now, put these characteristics up next to, or combine these rather, with the demagoguery that Weber says is fundamental to modern political life in politics as a vocation. He says you can't be a successful politician without being a demagogue. Now, how does the sober hero that Weber depicts at the end of Politics as a Vocation, that creature who's so mature, so responsible, so attentive to consequences, so full of perspective and patience, how does that figure measure up to the standards for charismatic performance and demagogic passion that he says are essential to survival in political life? Put a little differently, how does the understanding of politics as a strong, slow boring of hard boards cultivate charismatic authority? Where's the capacity in this carpenter for rallying the masses to a cause? The political actor Weber describes has what he calls inner determination and inner restraint. That's one piece of charisma. But what makes this actor appealing, especially in the age Weber calls mass emotionality? And here we're back to that feature of the masses that we've seen in Tocqueville, in Nietzsche, in Mill, and in others. Put another way, what makes charisma compatible with being deeply responsible, deeply realistic, patient, careful, attentive to consequences? Since when is charisma restrained and objective and unegoistic, especially vis-a-vis all the realities of the current predicament of politics that Weber described? A way to sum up this problem is to ask whether Weber has crafted a figure that ultimately won't really float on modern political waters. And perhaps that explains why charisma drains out of the text as it moves along. It's disappeared altogether from the final pages. So a text that starts out about talking about a charismatic leader who will be an alternative to modern machineries of domination and not be simply of them and administering them. A text that begins with that drawing of the charismatic leader ends with an ethical and mental weighing down of that creature, perhaps to the point that the creature no longer can be charismatic. That's one possible way of reading the tension in what Weber's trying to do. Now I want to turn to the conservative dimension of this political hero. As I've already suggested, it's important to notice how many of Weber's negative examples, counterexamples to the sober, ethical statesman, how many of them pertain to what we could call idealists or progressives in politics. He has no use at all for revolutionaries, but he also takes a lot of swipes at lefties of every sort, anyone who dreams of a substantially better world. From the beginning of this essay, Weber contrasts good political passion, appropriate political passion, with what he calls revolutionary excitability, which is a bad thing. And by the end, all radical projects are condemned as either dangerous or unrealistic or both, or as necessarily degenerating into their opposites. Weber says at one point, the dictatorship of the proletariat is a dictatorship like any other. The point is that in many ways, this lecture on politics as a vocation is an anti-revolutionary rant. That is, it's an attack on every kind of political idealism, pacifism, socialism, Christian spiritualism, any who seek societies based on love or solidarity, or even absolute justice or peace. Nor does he simply attack these things when they are adhering to an ethic of absolute ends or ultimate ends. It's the projects themselves that come in for his excoriation. He says on page 125, he who wants to establish absolute justice on earth requires a human machine. And this machine for him is not only the sign of domination, but will be fed by the usual spoils. Its motives will not be noble, but base. So the machine will convert, in his view, the revolutionary aim into ordinary cravings for what he calls revenge, power, booty, spoils. Now, the fact that he happened to be right about state communism doesn't necessarily mean that his attack on all who seek to establish absolute justice on earth is a fair one. He has the same critique of religious aims in politics. As we talked about last time, he says you shouldn't seek salvation of your own soul in politics or anybody else's soul because the means of politics is violence. Now here again, we might want to pause. If violence never absolutely disappears from politics, does it deserve the central place that Weber gives it? And it's just a question. We need to just ask, what happens to a theory when you make violence the absolute centerpiece of the domain called politics? Now, what Weber's saying here is that politics is finally not a domain for the realization of ideals or of strong notions of justice or of peace. It's not just a question for him of how you pursue these things. It's that these are not viable ideals given the medium and currency of politics, given it's the centrality of violence, given the attraction to power that brings people into it, given the nature of states as the central feature. He never questions that as the central feature of organized politics, and given the nature of orders of domination. He says that to refuse to accept this characteristic of politics and politics as the contents of politics, as violence, as states, as power, as orders of domination. To refuse to accept that about politics is, he says bluntly, to refuse to be a man. And it's important to note how often manliness is linked with reconciliation with reality, with accepting reality as it is, with being objective, and with being responsible. So the challenge is that idealists of every sort, those who would challenge his understanding of the political and the politically possible, idealists of every sort aren't just unrealistic, but unmanly. They're unable to bear the reality of politics, which is power and violence. They're unwilling to face what this world is really about. So the manliness and the conservatism end up reinforcing one another. Manliness for him means having the stomach for the permanent features of politics and facing them squarely. And all attempts to overcome those permanent features or to wish them away or to think otherwise, all those attempts are unmanly because they're unrealistic. So manliness is equated with realism and vice versa. What I'm trying to open up here is that, well, I think there's an enormous amount that is compelling in this essay, really worth thinking with and about. You have to beware at the same time of what you're being made to accept and reject as the nature and the limits of the political. And that's why I emphasized what we saw on that very first page, where in the very beginning of the essay, Weber defines politics rather narrowly, defines it in terms of the state, and defines it as having a medium of violence. So it's important to attend to what Weber mocks and decries and the means by which he does so, tracking the way that he associates realism, manliness, objectivity, violence, and reconciliation to state power. or put the other way around, tracking the ways that he opposes that string of terms to idealism and effeminacy and illusion and principle and otherworldliness. Okay, I want to close for now the discussion of politics as a vocation, and we'll turn to the other essay, Science as a Vocation, the other value essay. The paradox of this essay is that it is a non-scientific essay about the value and criteria of social science. Along the way, it also has a very strong set of statements about what appropriate social science pedagogy is, what should happen in the classroom. For me, like politics as a vocation, there's something very magnificent and moving and compelling about this essay, but there's also something, as there is with politics as a vocation, rather monstrous about it, both in what it champions and in what it rails against. Like politics as a vocation, science as a vocation calls on its audience, calls on the person who would enter the domain of knowledge and scholarship to be both passionate and objective. So we have that same move as we had with the figure in politics as a vocation. Here, the passion is invested in living for science, living for knowledge, living for discovery, and yet being egoless in this devotion, not being invested in it with a particular set of values or purposes beyond simply advancing science itself. So the encomium is to live for science and yet be utterly subordinated to its demands. Unless you think this is terribly weird, I would say this is the dominant view in the social sciences today, that this is exactly what it means to be a good social scientist, to be passionate about it, but uninvested at the level of method and discovery and knowledge. You can be invested in a particular project, as in, think one project is more important or more useful than another, but when it comes to setting out the frame and the purpose and the modality of discovery, one has to be egoless in exactly the way that, of course, Nietzsche criticized, but we'll get to that a little bit later. Like politics as a vocation, science as a vocation begins with a very dark view of the conditions of contemporary science. He surveys and decries the conditions of contemporary scholarly training and promotion in Germany and so forth, but also more generally, what Weber offers is an important assessment of what science has done to the world. Sure, it's advanced it technologically, but the world has also been what he calls disenchanted by science. And we're going to pause over that word for a minute. Disenchanted by science. First, let me just read you one sentence from 139. He says, "This means there are no mysterious, incalculable forces that come into play, but rather that one can, in principle, master all things by calculation. This means the world has been disenchanted." That's 139. So disenchantment, what is it? It's a huge theme for Weber, and it's what he thinks the modern world bears. A disenchanted world is one in which everything in the world has been reduced potentially to scientific understanding. It's a world in which everything can be explained. From love to the beauty of a sunset, from the origins of religion to the origins of the universe, and anything else you can think of. Another way another term for this would be desacralization. That is, taking the sacredness out of everything. Why? Because everything can be explained according to its mechanical or physical or chemical or biological or other processes. Now, disenchantment is, on the one hand, a descriptive term for Weber. He's describing a world that is being disenchanted by science, in which more and more and more of the world is being explained by science. Social science, natural science, mechanical and physical science, every kind of science. But it's important to grasp also what Weber's theoretical point is here. Disenchantment has implications beyond simply substituting, say, an explanation for what the chemical and biological factors or psychological factors are in falling in love, for the mystery of falling in love. Disenchantment not only means that everything in the world loses its magical and mysterious characteristics, or its sacred characteristics. So it means more than simply losing a certain aesthetic or religious moral dimension. It also means that science is systematically draining the world of meaning. It's draining the world of value and wonder. When everything can be explained scientifically, when everything is part of a process larger than itself, or has an explanation that is equivalent to or analogous to other explanations, when everything is part of a process larger than itself, then nothing has intrinsic value anymore. Everything loses its intrinsic standing, its intrinsic status, including and especially, according to Weber, human life and human death itself. Now, there's a much longer story to tell here that I don't actually have time to tell, but we'll just note that, in a sense, what's come true here in Weber's understanding is Nietzsche's prediction that with the rise of science comes what Nietzsche called simply the death of God, of enchanted creation and knowing. But, as Nietzsche predicted, this also entails the death of value and meaning itself. This is the hugely consequential aspect of science's power to disenchant. It doesn't mean we don't ascribe meaning to things, but it means that we rather understand that nothing has intrinsic meaning. The meaning is not contained in the object. So from the beginning of this essay, what Weber charts is not just the limits of a commitment to science. It doesn't deliver value or meaning. And he says that over and over again. Science is not going to tell you the value of something. It's not going to tell you the meaning of something. It's going to tell you how something works. Moreover, Weber charts the extent to which anything that science discovers today will be superseded tomorrow. That's the nature of scientific discovery. It goes on and on and on without end. Nothing lasts. So even science as a practice is in a certain way emptied out of intrinsic meaning because it's always going to be overtaken by what happens next. But there's more to Weber's claim here than even that. It's not just that science doesn't deliver value or meaning, and it's not just that anything you discover in scholarship will be superseded tomorrow, but science itself has what he understands to be a certain killing quality. The life of science, which for Weber stands for all contemporary scholarly life, is as violent in a certain way as the life of politics. The violence in this case, though, is toward values, toward meaning, toward God, insofar as God stands always for something larger than just the brute facticity of the world. Let me dwell here just a little longer because it's really important to get this part of Weber's understanding, especially since as soon as he lays all this out, he's about to redouble his own commitment to science. What are the things Weber understands to be destroyed by science in the larger sense of the word? Destroyed by submitting everything to rational inquiry and understanding. Well, let's start with charisma, which depends on the attribution of magical powers to a charismatic force. That's one of the things that he thinks is destroyed by the growing scientific domination of all things in the world. Then there's politics, which becomes a functioning rational machine with no lofty ends. There's individuality, or what he sometimes calls soul. These things are destroyed by rationality and calculation, and by explication according to scientific reasoning. All life values and purposes, which will lose their grounding in sacred truths or fundamental truths once we've really set science loose in the world. What's also sacrificed or lost is freedom. Why? Because it depends on the soul, he tells us. It depends on a rich inner life, because that's the place from which values are selected or chosen. And then there's simply meaning. Science can't deliver meaning. The reduction of everything in the world to rational or scientific explanation destroys meaning. So these are all the things that science and the ethos of progress that it attaches to destroys. And when we sigh and just say, well, that's progress, it's these multiple deaths that Weber thinks we are sighing over. These permanent losses that he thinks we are tacitly identifying. Progress, for Weber, is very much a part of what science is and does, but it now becomes its own valueless and empty project. It continues, nonetheless, we just keep exploring stuff, but not because it delivers meaning, not because it brings back value into the world, but just because that's what our commitment to science requires. So what I'm trying to surface for you is the deep, deep nihilism in Weber. That is, Weber himself does not mean to destroy meaning, but he recognizes that a world dominated by science will be finally a nihilistic world, a world in which there is no purpose or meaning. Because science can't answer the question of meaning, and its hegemony in the world kills meaning. It undermines the basis of all values. Now, just to go back to our other guy, Nietzsche, whom Weber is very much in conscious or unconscious conversation with here, Nietzsche knew this too. He knew this problem. He knew that once you have a world dominated by science, the commitment to explain everything according to reason, discovery, experiment, and so forth, that meaning would be destroyed, that nihilism would be the result. But Nietzsche, of course, asserted a set of values of his own anyway. He was willing to live in a world of ungrounded value and then assert arbitrary ones, to just say what had meaning or what should have meaning. So we got from him things like greatness in the realm of culture, or heroics that spring free of the demand of reason and rationalization. Weber goes a different direction. Weber says, look, there's always going to be beliefs. It's not like the scientific destruction of meaning means that we walk around without any. There's always going to be beliefs, what he calls different godheads. But these will increasingly be understood as arbitrary. My opinion, your opinion, my value system, your religion. They'll be increasingly understood as relative, as matters of faith, not as matters of grounded absolute truth. And then Weber says, the really manly activity of the thinker, the scholar, the scientist, is to submit your beliefs, your attachments, your convictions to ferocious scrutiny, to draw out their premises and implications, to treat them as objects of scientific analysis, to help you clarify what the implications are, and to show you, above all, that they don't have absolute grounding or absolute standing. They're just your attachments, and so the purpose of social science or the humanities is to help you see what the implications are of your particular attachment. But what does this mean? This scrutiny that Weber is calling for, this insistence that the purpose of scholarship and science and pedagogy is to clarify what you're attached to reveal it as arbitrary and contingent, and to show you what the implications are, this furthers the erosion of meaning that he is documenting. So what Weber is doing is arguing for science, arguing for a project that is abetting the disenchantment of the world, that is furthering the disenchantment of the world, that pushes us deeper and deeper into nihilism. Now let's make the final turn of the essay with Weber into his insistence about how the classroom should be a space of scientific inquiry and not a place for pushing particular politics or values. In the final turn of the essay, Weber distinguishes very sharply between the realm of politics, an order of power whose ultimate means is violence and which always involves the pursuit of some cause, and the realm of knowledge, an order of science, disinvestment of the individual, whose aim is truth. So we have a realm whose aim is a particular cause, and then a realm whose aim is truth. And we have politics as an order of power, and the order and knowledge as an order of science, objectivity. For Weber, just as truth is not what politics is about, one's not pursuing truth. One may think, oh, I am taking us to the promised land, I'm taking us to the true way that we should really live, but he knows that is always hogwash. Truth is not what politics is about. Analogously, power is not what science is about. That's not to say that science can't contribute to power. Weber's strongest argument on behalf of science is that it can contribute to the possibility of power. Whatever your end, whatever your particular purpose in life, science can help realize it. But the point is rather that even while knowledge may become power, power has no place whatsoever in inquiry, in science itself. So science can be converted to power at the far end, but power has no place in the production of knowledge. If it contaminates knowledge, the result won't be science. As soon as there's politics in the domain of inquiry, science, as the pursuit of truth, vanishes. On page 145, he draws a distinction, and again, it's just half a sentence. He draws a distinction between what he calls words that are plowshares to loosen the soil of contemplative thought, words that are plowshares, plows, to loosen the soil of contemplative thought, versus words that are swords against the enemies, words that are weapons. So the former, words that are plowshares to loosen the soil of contemplative thought, those are words that are presumably power-free. That's the conceit here, that you can have these power-free words in the classroom or in the research laboratory, versus words that are swords against the enemy, words that are weapons, words that have political effect. So science, knowledge, is, to now really just put the point bluntly, value-free. Politics is value-laden. True knowledge is always detached from power. Politics is made of it and bent upon it. The search for truth requires the absence of power, and power for Weber anywhere near the domain of knowledge will kill objectivity. Now, Weber's setting this out not just to tell you how you should approach your research. He's setting it out to make an argument against politics in the classroom. He argues that to take a political position in the classroom is not just to exploit the vulnerability of students. It is that, because he says, look, they're less capable of mounting a compelling argument than the teacher, and they're also dependent upon the teacher for their future. He goes further, though. He says politics in the classroom is violent. It literally violates the classroom, the domain of knowledge, with the weapons of politics. And thus it violates everything that the classroom holds, especially the inequality of the teacher-student relationship that's legitimated by authority, which itself is legitimated by science or the capacity for objective truth. All right, so that's Weber's view. You keep politics absolutely out of the classroom. You just teach facts, theories, texts that will, on the one hand, bring the world to students, and on the other hand, loosen students' attachments to their views and convictions by giving them some alternative things to think about and think with. I want to suggest that, as with the case of the figure of the hero, the political hero, and Weber's formulation of political ethics, again, I think there's something really compelling about this view. He's insisting on a space of knowledge and a space of thought that should be independent of bids for power. It should be unpoisoned by politicization. He's calling for a certain space of inquiry, a certain kind of domain of thoughtfulness and discovery that is the opposite of organizing, polemicizing, and mobilizing people, which is what you do in political life. And in this, he's trying to protect, I think, not merely science, but the pedagogic field from a certain kind of denigration and exploitation. And in doing so, he's trying to preserve the field of learning from invasions by partisanship, by religion, by any other particular value or force. He's also trying to make the classroom into a place where students can clarify and test their values, where they can greet what he calls inconvenient facts. He wants students to see the implications of the positions they hold and get an account of the meaning of their conduct. Of course, what this means is that Weber is depriving yet another arena of the potential for meaning-making. Because knowledge and its dissemination in the classroom is not to be used to generate values. It's to be used to produce and acquire an objective sense of things. Or it's to be used to test or challenge or reveal the unscientific nature of one's convictions. So now, again, meaning and values, which are already in terribly short supply in the modern world, according to Weber, are vanquished from yet another arena, the last arena where they might be regenerated, institutions devoted to thought. And this requires us to consider whether Weber's distinction between knowledge and politics really holds. Can knowledge really be value-free? And this is where I would begin the critique of Weber's essay. Let's go to Nietzsche again. Weber takes from Nietzsche the idea that science voids the world of meaning, that it destroys values. But he does not accept Nietzsche's critique of objectivity. He does not accept Nietzsche's insistence that all knowledge is what Nietzsche calls perspectival. He does not accept from Nietzsche the impossibility of the uninterpreted fact. Remember, Nietzsche said there is no such thing as merely seeing or merely naming or merely describing. Every description is already an interpretation. There's only perspectival seeing. There's only embodied knowing. Weber's fact-value distinction, his attempt to say there are facts and then there are values, Weber's insistence on keeping knowledge apart from politics depends on rejecting that part of Nietzsche. It depends on saying there is such a thing as bare facts. There is such a thing as objective truth about the world. I should probably hesitate a little on the bare facts thing. Weber knows that, well, I forgot about bare facts, the other bare facts, but I wasn't even going there. I'm trying to say this. Weber knows that facts don't speak for themselves. He knows you can line them up. So I can give you an argument that's all factual for the justification of the Israeli state, or I can give you an argument that's all factual for the lack of that justification. So he knows facts don't speak for themselves, but he does think that correctly ordered, correctly framed by theory and by method, there can be a truth. There is a truth that is separate from values. I want to suggest here that, at least in my own thinking, Nietzsche seems to me to have the better argument. That there really is no such thing as an objective presentation of a social phenomenon, a concept, a thinker, a practice. Because one of the things we've learned from Nietzsche is that human beings are meaning-making animals, even when they're engaged in science. We're always making meanings. We're always bringing meaning to what we imagine we are only describing or apprehending. Again, with Nietzsche, we don't simply see the world, we always see it from a particular angle and from a particular interpretation, with a particular lens, even if this is not perceptible to us. Put another way, to describe the world is always already to interpret it, never just to report it. Naming is never innocent. Description is never neutral. And that's why Weber's science is so different from Marx's science, which is so different from Bentham's science and Freud's science. All these guys were committed to science, but they have really, really different accounts of who we are, what motivates us, how we work, and so forth. The commitment to science, the commitment to objectivity, I'm suggesting, doesn't hold. Even as Weber's argument for the importance of presenting inconvenient facts, the importance of challenging our convictions and our values, the importance of trying to clarify and understand where they came from, what their implications are, all those things one can affirm. One can even affirm the importance of avoiding explicit political stands in the classroom. But these things don't keep politics out of knowledge or pedagogy, including Weber's. Indeed, what you've had this term in this class, from me as well as from your graduate student instructors, is not just the objective teaching of a set of texts, but interpretations, encounters with some of the great thinkers of modern Western political theory. You haven't learned Tocqueville objectively, you've learned my Tocqueville, or Marx Tocqueville, or Jack's, or Nina's. You haven't learned Marx, you've learned the Marx that we're bringing to you. From a different teacher, you would get different inflections, different emphases, different selections of readings, different ways of connecting them, different themes pulled out as important. That doesn't mean what happens here is purely subjective or ideological or purely opinion. Any teacher worthy of the name, I think, will struggle to give you more than that, more than their own values. And for me, the point of working with these really great texts and great thinkers is, in part, what Weber was pushing, to dislodge one's predilections and limitations with the provocations that these texts bring. They're each, I think, inconvenient thinkers in the way that Weber calls for the presentation of inconvenient facts. And that's one of the reasons we've urged you to appreciate each one of them before submitting them to critique. Why we've tried to represent the genius and the power of their arguments regardless of the particular political investments or political allergies or contradictions or incoherences that each one has. My larger point, though, is that there's no objective reading of these texts. They're only interpretations. And the worst pedagogical crime we could commit is to tell you that there is such an objective reading and that we are delivering it. So what I'm suggesting is there's actually something a bit sad in Weber's essay as he empties intellectual life and the classroom of the potential to be a meaning-making site. And there's also something a little bit violent, or as I suggested earlier, even monstrous in the essay. Because in the name of objectivity, in the name of truth, in the name of a value-free research and pedagogical endeavor, what is he putting over on us? What's he putting over on students? He's pushing the conceit of objectivity itself, the idea that there is a realm of absolutely objective knowing, detached from the persons and the ages and the frames and the interpretive lenses that generate it. And he's disavowing the values that lurk in any ostensibly objective account, such as the values I tried to surface today in Weber's account of politics, or the values that circulate in all political science. The conceit of objectivity, the insistence on the separation of facts and values, actually makes these values more difficult to surface and more difficult to challenge. They become ruses, tricks. And I'm suggesting that, by contrast, the classroom and academic work is actually a place for overtly and avowedly introducing new thoughts, new angles of vision, and challenging and refining those that we hold. Weber agrees with this, but he parts ways with it in the insistence that there can be an unpolitical moment in this work. And I'm saying there's never a possibility of escaping from the power entailed in knowledge. Weber wants to keep power out of knowledge. Nietzsche reminded us it's in it always. Just the power of seeing, just the power of knowing, of interpreting. You can't know something independently of the values that you attribute to it and bring to it. So Weber's kind of sad, pessimistic formulation of politics as only dwelling in power, and his sad, pessimistic formulation of knowledge as only dwelling in objectivity, which will more and more empty the world of meaning and make it a more and more nihilistic place, that need not be our ending point here. I'm suggesting instead we can affirm the possibility of being what Weber would call responsible as well as passionate, political and knowing beings who cultivate and pursue political ideals, even as we submit them to constant reflection and scrutiny, even as we know these ideals don't have an ultimate grounding, and even as we know that their pursuit is always fraught with some risk and some danger. I'm suggesting we, in contrast to Weber, try to affirm our modern condition as one in which we know that meaning is never given in a thing, it's only created. It's created by us. We are the meaning-making creatures. But we don't have to submit to that Weberian ethos of a manly stance toward the world that ends up offering us too few prospects for hope and too little possibility. We can refuse Weber's disjuncture between facts and values, but also between politics and redemption, without the fear of being fools. I think we can make this refusal on clear, if not exactly solid, epistemological and political ground, as we have in this class tried to think theoretically about politics and politically about theory. That's what we've tried to do this term, and that's where we come to a close. We are done. Thank you. You all have been great. I want to take a moment to thank the real laborers in the course, not only you all, but Jack and Nina and Mark. Thank you. All right, let me take a minute to see if there are questions about things I said today. We do need about 5 to 10 minutes for evaluations. But I also want to give you a chance to ask questions about Weber. As I said, we won't be able to answer those questions after you get your final. So this is the moment. If you wrote something down just now and you don't understand it, or if you want to ask a question or pose a problem, take your time and do it.